Today's two stories are about gruesome deaths that totally baffled everybody involved in investigating them. Now, at first, the cases did seem relatively simple, at least on the surface, but as investigators looked closer, what they found was really going on was completely out of this world. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button some trail mix. But don't tell them you've added a secret ingredient, chocolate-covered spiders. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One evening in 1890, a young man named Tadeo Fulgencio Mejia laid in bed inside of this big, expensive mansion that he'd recently bought in Guanajuato, Mexico. And Tadeo was feeling really miserable because he was sick with a fever. And so he rolled over and he let out this long, agonizing sigh, and then he heard his wife, Maria, come into the room. And he looked up and he saw that she had a cup of tea in her hand, and she walked over and she set it on his bedside table. And even though Tadeo, he really felt physically terrible, it was like the instant his wife was right next to him, taking care of him, just her presence, it made him smile. Now, Tadeo and Maria had actually only recently gotten married, but Tadeo was like head over heels in love with her. She was smart, she was fun, she was very caring, she was beautiful. And so far, their life together, despite it being relatively short so far, had gotten off to a really nice start. So Tadeo had not been born wealthy, but he had worked his way up to becoming a very successful mining engineer. And then after becoming very wealthy and successful, he had met Maria, fallen in love with her, they'd gotten engaged really quickly, and Tadeo had actually bought her this huge mansion they were in right now as a wedding present. And this mansion, this home, really was ideal for both of them, not just because it was a beautiful, grand home, but also because the town it was in, Guanajuato, was where Tadeo worked. And it was also where Maria's whole family lived, so it was perfect. Plus, the neighborhood was clean, it was quiet, it was safe, and the neighbors, for the most part, were all also upper-class professionals just like Tadeo, so they fit right in. So for Tadeo, his amazing wife, his big house, and his nice neighborhood, those all felt like symbols of his great success. So, on this night, although Tadeo did obviously feel very sick, he also felt really proud and very satisfied with his life. And so right after his wife sat down next to him on the bed, Tadeo sat up, he smiled at her again, and he grabbed the tea she had brought for him and he took a sip of it. And then Maria, she smiled back at him, but then she looked at him with an almost apologetic look on her face and said that, she did have to go right now or she was going to be late for dinner with her family. And when she said this, Tadeo felt a little bit uneasy. So Maria went to her family's house for dinner a lot, since they lived walking distance away. But normally, Tadeo physically walked her there. Because to get to her family's house, Maria had to leave their safe neighborhood where they lived and pass along a couple of sketchier streets. And so Tadeo was always concerned that if she was walking in those areas without him, that she might get mugged or attacked or something. She was vulnerable. But Tadeo clearly was just way too sick to walk her that night. And so he told her that he was really worried about her going alone, but Maria sort of brushed him off and said, everything was going to be just fine. Then she leaned over, she gave him a kiss, and she said goodbye, and then she got up, she grabbed her handbag, and he watched her leave. A few hours later, Tadeo was still in bed, sort of half asleep, when he heard these sudden, frantic knocks at his front door that didn't stop. Somebody was banging on his door over and over again. And Tadeo's first thought was that it must be Maria. But Maria obviously had a key to their house, so he didn't know why she'd be knocking. But the knocking sounded so panicked that he immediately felt like something must be wrong here. So even though Tadeo was very groggy still and quite feverish, he leapt out of bed and rushed to the door and flung it open. But when he looked outside, he didn't see Maria. He saw a small group of his neighbors, and they all seemed really freaked out, like something had happened clearly. And one of them actually looked at Tadeo with tears in her eyes, and she said that Tadeo needed to come with them. Just minutes later, Tadeo was led over to the entrance of this alleyway that was right outside of his nice, quiet neighborhood. And over here, there were all these people that had sort of swarmed around the entrance to this alleyway. And as soon as he got there, Tadeo could see that the alleyway itself was swarming with police. And so Tadeo, he pushed through the crowd because he's starting to panic, like, what's going on here? Where's Maria? He gets through the crowd and he looks into the alleyway. This is his first unobstructed view. And it's very clear that in the middle of the alleyway, something's on the ground. And when police sort of stepped out of the way, he could tell what was on the ground was his wife's body. Maria had been stabbed in the back, and she was now lying face down on the pavement, surrounded by blood. Tadeo was so shocked and still so feverish that it's like he couldn't even process what he was seeing. I mean, it all seemed like this just had to be fake or something. Like, this can't be real. So when a police officer came over and asked Tadeo if he was the victim's husband, all Tadeo could do was just slowly nod and just stare at his wife's body. And then, at some point the officer asked him, like, where were you tonight? Do you have any idea what happened to your wife? But Tadeo, it's like he was hearing these words, but just couldn't process it. And so he didn't say anything. He just continued to nod and just stared at his wife. Later that night, Tadeo was back at his home, just sitting on his couch in a total daze, just shivering. I mean, he was shivering from his fever, from the sweat that was all over his body, and he was also just shivering from coming down from having this huge surge of adrenaline after seeing his wife dead in the alleyway. But more than anything, he was just like frozen. I mean, he could barely remember even getting back to his house. And so now he just like sat there, like he had no idea what he was gonna do. But eventually his body became so exhausted that he just shut down, he keeled over on the couch, and he just passed out right there. And at some point in the night, Tadeo began having this horrifying fever dream. In this dream, Tadeo was looking out the window from his living room and he could see Maria. And she was stumbling down the road and there was this huge trail of blood behind her and she was screaming for Tadeo to help her. And then suddenly Tadeo woke back up again and he found himself sitting on the couch and he sort of took stock of where he was. He realized that was just a dream, and then he realized he was drenched in sweat and his heart was racing. Like, that dream felt so real. But then as he was just sitting there in stunned silence, just sort of processing that that really was a dream, he heard something that immediately gave him goosebumps. He could hear somewhere in the distance the sound of his wife's voice calling his name. Over the next few days, Tadeo's fever went away, but his fever dreams or his nightmares he was having about his wife calling out for him, those didn't stop. And every once in a while, when he would wake up from one of these horrible nightmares, he would again hear the sound of Maria calling to him. And it was like always so clear. He knows he's awake again. He knows he's not dreaming anymore, and he would hear her voice. He was certain it was her. But he could never tell where the sound of her voice was coming from after he would wake up from these dreams. He couldn't tell if she was calling from outside the house or inside the house, or if it was just in his own head. But it didn't matter. I mean, every time it felt so real. Like, that was not a part of the dream. That was real life, and it was terrifying. At the same time that Tadeo was grappling with the loss of his wife, and he's having these terrible nightmares, and he's trying to like pick the pieces of his life back up and put them back together, he also was going to the police to try to get more information about what happened to his wife. Like, what did they find in the alleyway? Like, who could have done this? What happened? But unfortunately, the police really hadn't learned much so far. They didn't know who did this, they hadn't found a murder weapon, and they told Tadeo that when they found his wife's body, she didn't have any personal belongings near her. And Tadeo said, well, she should have had her handbag. She left the house with her handbag. She should have had it with her. And so the police said, well, no, it wasn't there. So maybe what this is just a robbery gone wrong. And they took her purse and they killed her in the process. Now, Tadeo didn't doubt that that could have been what happened to his wife. I mean, one of his chief fears about his wife walking alone in those sketchier neighborhoods was the fear that she might be attacked, she might be mugged. And so very likely that could have happened. But Tadeo wanted the police to fully investigate and figure out, like, who did this? Was it a robbery gone wrong? He wanted to know for sure who did it, find them, like, bring them to justice. He wanted answers. And the police were very committed to trying to get him those answers. But unfortunately, days turned into weeks, turned into months with no updates, and Tadeo was left feeling like What's going to happen here? Have they forgotten about my wife? Like, is there just nothing? Like, is no one going to be held to account for what happened? And so after a few months of just relative silence and just feeling like he can't move on with his life without some sort of closure here, Tadeo found himself feeling overwhelmed by really three emotions. There was grief over the loss of his wife. There was anger at what he viewed was just ultimately police incompetence or police, laziness or deprioritization of his wife's case, and guilt, because in a way, he did feel responsible for his wife's death. If he had just sucked it up and, despite being sick, walked her to her family's house, maybe he could have protected her. Also, he thought about the fact that he was the one who bought this house. And so in virtue of putting her here, she had to walk that route to see her family. And so in that way as well, he jeopardized her safety. He sort of pushed her into the environment where she was killed. And so he was feeling really, really guilty. And so because of all these horrible feelings Tadeo was feeling, combined with still no word on who actually did this to his wife or why, Tadeo felt like he was basically losing his mind. He stopped going to work and instead just spent all hours basically sitting in his living room, staring out the window. It was like there was some part of him that thought if he just waited long enough, he would see Maria walking down the street towards him, calling out to him like he had seen her so many times in his nightmares right out this window. And at the same time, Tadeo more and more was convinced he could hear the sound of Maria calling out to him, basically at all hours. Whether he had just come out of one of those awful nightmares, which he was still having, or if it was just the middle of the day and he's just sitting there looking out the window, like not asleep at all, he would still hear her voice. Didn't know if it was inside the house, outside, in his head, he didn't know, but it was like she was constantly on his mind, either because he was waiting to see her out the window or he was waiting to hear her. It was like all-consuming. Maria was the only thing he thought about. And eventually, Tadeo began to believe that the reason he was feeling the way he was feeling was not just overwhelming grief, like the dreams he was having, the nightmares, like hearing his wife calling to him at all hours and believing he was going to see her out this window, that wasn't grief. That in fact, it was his wife's spirit contacting him, that she was basically telling him that she cannot rest until her murder is solved. And Tadeo, when he realized that that was what was going on from his perspective, he realized that he had to take matters into his own hands. He needed, for the sake of his wife, to solve her murder so she could finally rest. And so Tadeo, he retraced his wife's steps, he interviewed his neighbors, he searched all over town for her handbag and for the knife that was used to kill her. But despite how motivated he was to try to solve this thing and do right by his wife, he didn't uncover anything new. There was no new leads, no new evidence, no clues, nothing. It was one dead end after another. However, over the course of Tadeo's investigation into his wife's death, one thing did become increasingly clear, and that was Guanajuato was not nearly as safe as everybody thought. First, a drifter passing through Guanajuato was kidnapped. Now, nobody really connected this to Tadeo's wife's murder, at least not at first, because this person who went missing, they were never found. And so it was not really clear what happened to them, wasn't clear if they were killed, there was no clear overlaps between this person and Maria. And so at first, it was just this thing that happened in Guanajuato and nobody connected it to Maria. But then, about a week after that person got kidnapped, another woman who lived on the outskirts of town, she disappeared. And then just days after that, another man went missing. Now, in each of these three new disappearances, none of them were found. They literally just disappeared, and that was it. Nobody knew what happened to them. But, as Tadeo is out there talking to people and trying to figure out what's going on with his wife, more and more people in town began to say, this is not a safe place. What if there's a serial killer on the loose here, and your wife could have been the first victim, and now they're refining their methods and they're taking people away and they're killing them and they're not even being found. That was the consensus in town. And so Tadeo, he's hearing this new theory about a crazed killer from the people in town, and he's still continuing his own investigation, but it's basically going nowhere. The police are still not giving him anything. They're continuing their own investigation. They're hearing about this killer theory, but that's going nowhere. And so basically Tadeo didn't know what to do. He felt like there's a whole lot of things that could have happened, but nobody really knows. However, he wound up having a conversation with a very unlikely person just a few days after that third person went missing. And this conversation inspired a brand new approach for how Taddeo would figure out what happened to his wife. It was an extreme idea, one that he certainly hadn't thought of himself, but as soon as he heard it, he felt like, this is what I gotta do. The next day, Taddeo walked down a residential street in Guanajuato towards the sprawling, beautiful, expensive-looking home. His heart was racing, so to calm himself down, he put one hand into his pocket, and he felt the cold metal of the gun that he had brought along. So after his conversation the day before with this unlikely person, Taddeo had completely changed his investigative approach. And now he was fully convinced that he was right on the cusp of finding his wife's killer, and that the answer was actually inside of this very expensive-looking home. That's why he'd brought the gun. And it was also why now he went up to this house and he turned the front doorknob, and he found it was unlocked, just like he knew it would be. Then, without knocking or announcing himself at all, Taddeo walked inside of this house, he shut the door behind him, and he went directly to a staircase that led down to the basement. And standing at the top of these stairs, Taddeo felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He was so scared that he almost wanted to turn around and run out of the house. But he was also so grief-stricken and so desperate that he felt like this was the only way he would ever find the truth. So he took a deep, steadying breath, and then he walked down the stairs. And what Taddeo saw in the basement looked like a scene out of a horror movie. It was almost completely dark down there, except for some flickering light from a couple of tall black candles. On one side of the room, from what he could see, there was what appeared to be several mangled human bodies stacked up in a pile. And on the other side of the room was like this bizarre occult altar. And on this altar, there was a long knife, some kind of a book, like a spell book, and a chalice that was filled with human blood. And then also painted on the wall above this altar was a red pentagram that clearly had been drawn in blood as well. And so Taddeo, he just stood there for a moment, staring at the bodies, staring at the altar, the pentagram, and it was just quiet for a moment. And then there was the sound of a single gunshot. It didn't take long for the police to show up at this beautiful residence after a neighbor had reported hearing that single gunshot coming from inside. Officers pounded on the door, and when nobody answered, they just went inside. And once inside, the police found the home was very quiet, very still. They looked around on the whole first floor, but they didn't see anything unusual. But then one of the officers found a staircase that led down to the basement. And so down they went. And when they reached the basement, they saw the same horrible scene that Taddeo had. I mean, it basically is like this occult lair down there, complete with bodies and blood and altars and all this terrible stuff. But there was something else in the basement that the police saw that Taddeo did not. So it would turn out that when Taddeo began his own investigation into his wife's death, when he began hitting one roadblock after another and he's not learning anything and it just feels like one big dead end. Well, when that happened, he was so frustrated but so determined to know what happened to his wife that he turned to a local witch and he asked them, hey, is there any way for me to contact the dead directly? Like, can I talk to my wife and have her just tell me who killed her? I have to know who killed her. Like, can you do that for me? She's already whispering to me. I'm already having these visions in my dreams of her. I know she's there. I just need some help. I gotta have this conversation with her. And the witch is like, I have just the thing. There's a ritual you can follow that if you follow all the steps exactly, you can have that interaction with your dead wife and you can get the information you're seeking. And so the witch gives Taddeo this list of very specific instructions, which included human sacrifice. And Taddeo, he takes down all the instructions and then he sets out trying to perform this ritual. He goes out and he kidnaps that drifter, the first person who went missing from town. Taddeo kidnapped them and did kill them for this ritual. But after following all the steps, Taddeo didn't get to talk to his wife. She didn't appear. She didn't tell him who murdered her. And so what does Taddeo do? He goes out and kidnaps somebody else in town, that woman on the outskirts of town. He kidnaps her. He kills her for ritual number 2. But again, despite following all the steps, he couldn't contact his wife. It didn't work. And so he goes out again, he kidnaps that man and he kills him, and he performs the ritual for a third time and it still doesn't work. And so what does he do? A few days after that third person disappeared and everybody in town is freaking out about a serial killer because there actually was one, it was Taddeo. He speaks to the witch again and says, hey, your instructions aren't working. What do I gotta do to talk to my dead wife here? And the witch says, well, there's one other way you can perform this ritual. You can be the sacrifice. And Taddeo, he's thinking, this is pretty extreme, but I want to figure out what happened to my wife. And so Taddeo, the now known serial killer, wanders into his own house. His house was the big, beautiful house, into the basement of his mansion where he was keeping the bodies of the people he was killing. And he had his ritual he performed on the altar. And he goes down there and he ritualistically kills himself in order to connect with his wife. And so he shoots himself and he dies. And then the police show up a little bit after. They come into the basement, they see this horrible scene, and what they saw that Taddeo didn't was his dead body in the middle of the floor. And so in the end, Taddeo literally became a murderer. He killed 3 people. He ended his own life, all in an effort to try to figure out what happened to his wife. And what happened to his wife is it actually was just random. It was a robbery gone wrong. On the night of April 2nd, 1899, a cowboy named Charles Casimir rode his horse through a blizzard near Lyman County in South Dakota. He was following another cowboy named Frank Hepa, who was also on horseback. So Charles and Frank were both employees at this large ranch where typically they would work with a big team. And they had come out here with a big team, but they'd gotten separated from the rest of their group while tracking down some missing cattle. And so now they were looking for somewhere to take shelter from this huge storm, which had sort of come out of nowhere. And Charles was terrified as he rode through the storm, but not because of the storm itself. I mean, he had ridden through any number of big storms in the past. He was a rugged guy, and even though this storm was quite bad, that wasn't what was making him so fearful. What really bothered him, what really unsettled him right now, was the fact that he was out here just with this guy Frank by himself. He was like the last person he wanted to be around alone. So 5 years ago, Charles knew that Frank here had been charged with murder for brutally killing his business partner over an argument about money. Now, Frank had gotten off by claiming self-defense, but as Charles had heard it, that was pretty much impossible, and he just couldn't understand how Frank had gotten away with it. Because Frank's partner, the guy who had been killed, had literally been stabbed in the back. So how is that self-defense? So ever since Charles had heard the story about one of his coworkers, he'd avoided working one-on-one with Frank. And fortunately, most of the time he was in a big group, and so even if Frank was a part of that group, he was never isolated with him. But the snowstorm had thrust Charles into sort of a worst-case scenario. Bad storm, isolated with a potential killer. And on top of that, because of how bad the visibility was in the storm, Charles didn't even know where they were. I mean, he was lost. But as he was riding along behind Frank, despite all the issues he had with him, he did appear to know where he was going. And so Charles, he didn't want to freeze to death out here, so he ignored his fears and continued to follow Frank. And for a while, that's just how it went. Frank leading, Charles following in relative silence, like not much communication between them, the storms blowing all around them. And then eventually, Charles started to notice that his horse seemed to be getting really tired. And that would be a really big problem if his horse couldn't continue. And it didn't appear like they were near any structure or any landmark or anything. I mean, Charles doesn't know where they are. Again, Frank appears to have a sense of where they're going. But right as Charles was really starting to get worried about his horse, basically not being able to make it, suddenly this structure sort of appeared out of the darkness up ahead of them. They really needed to get out of this storm or else they could freeze to death. And so this was life-saving, but that also meant that Charles now would not only have to be alone with Frank, but he'd have to be alone with Frank inside of a small space. And so even though Charles knew he couldn't turn this down, he had to go or else he could die, it was like, with a lot of reservation, they go inside of this building. A half an hour later, Charles was stoking a fire inside of the shack's fireplace and was waiting for the place to heat up. But already it was so much better than being out in the storm. And so as Charles is sort of looking around and Frank's getting his gear together on the side of the shack, Charles noticed that there was lots of dust built up on everything, suggesting that nobody had been in here for a long time. This was maybe an abandoned place, he didn't know. However, when he made a comment to Frank about that, saying, how lucky it was they found this place, this rundown, abandoned place, Frank corrected him and said, actually, no. Luck had nothing to do with it, and this is not really an abandoned place. Frank said the reason he knew this house would be here is because he used to live here. At first, Charles was like, oh, that makes sense. That's why Frank knew where he was going. That's how he was able to navigate the storm and get us here, because he used to live here. And so at first, Charles is like, oh, cool, that makes sense. But then he's thinking, wait a minute, I know that Frank's business partner, who Frank killed, whether it was self-defense or just premeditated murder, clearly Frank did do the killing of his business partner. It happened, apparently, according to the story, inside of Frank's house. And Charles is looking around at the dust on everything inside of here, and he's thinking, wait a minute, clearly Frank hasn't lived here recently, and he's saying he used to live here. Is it possible that this shack is where the killing happened? Is this where Frank killed his business partner, this small space? And at this point, he looks over at Frank, who's now sitting on a stool by the fire, and he's eating some beans out of a can, and he's sipping some whiskey from his flask, acting totally unbothered about potentially being in the exact space where he killed somebody, potentially. And Charles, it was like he had these spiraling thoughts of fear. Like he's looking at this guy who he doesn't want to be around. He's in a place where maybe he's killed someone, and it was like too much. He became completely overwhelmed and just knew he had to go. He had to go out of the shack and just get away from Frank. He didn't even care that there was a storm raging outside. He just had to get away. And so really, without coming up with a plan at all, Charles just looks over at Frank and he's like, I'm gonna go outside and get a breath of fresh air. And then before Frank could say or do anything, Charles just turned around and walked out the door out into the storm. Now, once Charles was outside, despite the storm raging all around him, he immediately felt a sense of relief, because anything was better than being inside of that horrible place with that horrible person. And so he began walking over to the horses just to check on them and again, just kind of collect his thoughts and just kind of center himself before he figures out what he's gonna do next. And he's walking over to the horses, and as he's about to grab the first horse, he hears something behind him. The next day, not far away from the shack, a couple of ranchers were fixing a fence that had been damaged by the big storm when they spotted a cowboy off in the distance who was on horseback riding through the snow. And the cowboy, it looked like something was wrong with him, like he was very weak or something, because he was kind of slouching to one side like he might fall off his horse at any moment. So the ranchers got on their own horses and they rode over to him, and when they pulled up alongside of him, they thought, we were right to come over here because this guy is a mess. His lips were blue, his eyes were wide, and he was just staring off into the distance like he was in some kind of shock. And so quickly, the ranchers pulled this guy off the horse, they wrapped him in a blanket, and after a couple of minutes, that look of shock on his face began to fade, and color returned to his face, and they gave him some of their hot coffee, and after a minute or two, this guy began to talk. However, when they asked him, what happened? Why are you out here? What's going on? All the man would say is that he wanted to bring them back to the shack where he had spent the night before, because apparently something really bad had happened inside. And so eventually this guy, this cowboy, climbed back on his horse and he began riding back in the direction of the shack, and the ranchers followed along. And pretty soon, as they were getting closer to the shack, the ranchers began to look at each other with these kind of worried looks because they realized what shack he was likely bringing them to. They knew that shack. So these ranchers had lived in this area for years, and 5 years ago, they had helped the local sheriff clean up the aftermath of a grisly murder at a nearby shack, Frank's shack. And the murder was Frank's business partner. And so these ranchers had literally seen the body of the victim, covered in blood, the knife still in his back, lying face down on the ground in front of the fireplace. And so now, as they were nearing where they knew this shack was, that's all they're thinking about. How is it possible that this guy is saying something bad happened and he's bringing us to the site of this grisly murder? It just felt really unsettling. And so sure enough, this cowboy leads these ranchers back to the very shack they know so well where that murder happened 5 years ago. The cowboy gets off and he leads them inside, and the ranchers, they're looking at each other like, what are we gonna find inside of here? Like, what's going on? And they walk into this little space, this little shack, and they can't believe what they're looking at. It was like the most intense, really awful deja vu. On the ground, in the middle of this cabin, lying face down with the head near the fireplace, was the body of a man covered in blood with a knife plunged into his back. And so the ranchers, they look at the body, and then they look over at the cowboy who's led them here and shown them the body, and he's not putting up any sort of fight. And the ranchers, they put their hands on their guns and they look to the cowboy and they're like, who did this? Like, were you the only one here? Like, was anybody else here last night? Like, what happened? And the cowboy, all he said was, no, it was just me. I was the only one here besides, him. And so the ranchers at this point, they didn't even know what to do. So they just walked over, they grabbed the cowboy who didn't resist. They tied him up, they brought him outside, they put him on one of their horses, and they brought him back to town, and they handed him over to the sheriff and said, he's a murderer. 2 months later, in June of 1899, a grand jury met to discuss this case, and they were immediately struck by just how closely the facts in this case matched the case from the stabbing 5 years ago. The details were basically identical. You have two cowboys who walked into this particular cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and then one of them turns up dead with a knife in his back. Just, it happened on 2 separate occasions, 5 years apart. However, there was one major difference between the first instance and the second instance. This time, in the second instance, the dead man was Frank Hepa himself. The very man who had been the killer from the first case was the victim in the second case. The cowboy that the ranchers had found, who was on death's door with blue lips, who led them back out to the cabin, that was Charles. And so today, during this grand jury hearing, when Charles took the stand, the jurors were expecting him to say that yes, he had stabbed Frank, because who else could have done it, but that it was very likely done in self-defense. That was their expectation of what he would likely say, because it was really the only explanation Charles had that might get him off the hook. But when Charles spoke, he did not claim self-defense. Instead, he told a story that was arguably the least believable defense he could have possibly given. He said on the night that Frank was killed, he had panicked because he had realized he was inside of the very shack where very likely this guy had stabbed to death his former partner, and he was just so frightened by the whole experience that he decided to go outside, get a breath of fresh air, to just get away from Frank for a second. And Charles would say, like, he didn't even have a plan. He didn't know if he was gonna come back in or if he was gonna leave. There was obviously a storm going on. But he said he left the cabin, and he knows Frank is the only one inside of the cabin at this point. Charles goes outside, he's making his way over to the horses, and as he's about to grab that first horse, he hears something behind him, and he says he thinks it's Frank, and he whips around, but there's no one there. There's no one outside. However, he notices in the window of this shack, this cabin where he's just come from, he sees what looks like a shadow moving near the window. And then he hears loud commotion inside of the cabin. He knows Frank's alone in there, but he doesn't know what's going on. And so he runs back over to the cabin just out of curiosity. He opens the door back up and he looks inside, and it's just Frank. But Frank is now face down in the middle of the cabin with his head near the fireplace, and a knife is plunged into his back, and there's nobody else inside the cabin. And immediately Charles said he felt like he knew what happened. Frank clearly has been killed by a ghost. And he was so scared, so unbelievably perplexed at what he was seeing, that in a true panic, he just turned, fled the cabin, hopped on a horse, and just started riding away with no plan. And it was only by pure luck that the next day those ranchers found him before he just collapsed and died. That was his defense. So a claim like this, that Charles, was basically saying, I didn't do it, a ghost did it, was so sensational that naturally this immediately attracted a whole bunch of media attention. And for the most part, the journalists that flocked into the area to cover this trial, they expected to hear a whole bunch of sensational testimony in addition to this initial claim. They were, expecting to hear lawyers sort of poke apart this whole story and just have it be kind of a circus in the courthouse. But that eventually, the truth would come to light that, of course, Charles, he did this. He must have stabbed Frank. Who else could have done it? It couldn't have been a ghost. And then very likely he would be found guilty, he'd be hung, and that would be that. But that's not what happened. At the very last moment, Charles was told he was free to go. The grand jury had decided they were not going to pursue charges against Charles. But this meant, at least in the eyes of the very astonished people that heard about this, that had been following this whole case, that in essence, by doing that, the grand jury was siding with Charles and basically saying, yep, must have been a ghost. That's what did it. And that just seemed so absurd that these, rational members of the grand jury, who were mostly comprised of, very practical, hardened ranchers from the area, how could they possibly really believe that a ghost did this? But that really is what they believed. That is actually the reasoning they gave for why they did not pursue Charles. They believed his story. A ghost must have killed Frank. But they have a very specific reason for believing that. There was one fact that ultimately pushed the jury to believe that. And that fact was this. 5 years earlier, when Frank stabbed his partner, whether it was premeditated or self-defense, doesn't really matter. What we do know is he definitely stabbed to death his partner. When he did that, the knife he used was taken into evidence, and it was given to the prosecution, who put it in a safe, and they kept it there for the trial. But on the night before the trial began, the knife inexplicably disappeared from the safe. And the prosecution said, no one's opened the safe. No one has access to this safe. There's no way anyone could have that knife other than the prosecution. And the prosecution is like, we didn't touch it. We did not move that knife. We have no idea what happened to it. And so basically, no one knew what happened to the knife. It just went missing and they carried on with the trial without it. It was like, okay, crazy anomaly, it is what it is. However, the knife would turn back up again 5 years later when it was found stabbed into Frank Hepa's back. Now keep in mind, Charles didn't even know Frank when Frank was accused of murder. He wasn't even following the case. Why would he have stolen the knife from the prosecutor's safe? Or how could he? Charles has no connection to this knife whatsoever. And so basically the jury was left with well, wait a minute. If Charles didn't have this knife and he didn't do this, is it possible that maybe the victim's ghost is the one who stole the knife in the first place and then 5 years later exacted their revenge on their killer, Frank, by killing him the same way they were killed with the same knife in the same location? Well, it's up to you if you want to believe that story, but what is the case is that line of thinking was the actual literal reason that Charles was let go. They basically said, yep, a ghost did it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right.
The sharp, violent crack of splintering wood echoed through the tiny one-room schoolhouse. Mary froze. Her hand was suspended in the air, gripping a small piece of white chalk right against the blackboard. She didn't even have time to turn around before the heavy wooden front door flew open and slammed against the interior wall with a massive thud. 2 men stepped into the room. Their faces were entirely covered by thick, dark masks, and the taller of the 2 men was holding a double-barreled shotgun, and he had it pointed directly at Mary's chest. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over for a fancy steak dinner. But when you serve the food, make sure the like button's steak is actually just a painted piece of old tire rubber. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a Tuesday morning in early October of 1972, 20-year-old Mary Gibbs woke up in her small house in rural Victoria, Australia. The sun was just starting to come up, and the air was already getting warm. Mary got out of bed, walked into her small kitchen, and put a kettle on the stove to make some tea. She stood by the window as the water boiled, looking out at the dense, dry brush that stretched out for miles in every direction. Mary lived a very quiet, very routine life, and she absolutely loved it. She had recently taken a job as a teacher, and she was incredibly proud of that fact. She poured her tea, sat at her small wooden table, and went over her lesson plans for the day. She was the only teacher at the Faraday State School, which was a tiny, incredibly isolated educational outpost meant to serve the few farming families that lived out in this remote part of the Australian countryside. After she finished her breakfast, Mary went to her bedroom to get dressed. She put on a simple dress, and then she sat on the edge of her bed to put on her shoes. And Mary had this one specific pair of heavy leather boots that she wore almost every single day. They were tall, lace-up boots with a very thick, heavy, solid wooden and leather heel. They were practical for walking around in the country where the ground was uneven and rocky, and you always had to keep an eye out for snakes. She pulled the thick laces tight, tied them off, grabbed her canvas bag full of school supplies, and headed out the door. The drive to the Faraday State School took Mary down a series of long, unpaved dirt roads. Her car kicked up huge clouds of red dust that hung in the air behind her. There were no other cars on the road. There were no houses, no gas stations, no signs of civilization at all, just endless miles of scrubland and eucalyptus trees. And after about 20 minutes, she pulled up to the school. The school itself was literally just one single room. It was a small, square building made of wood and corrugated iron, sitting completely by itself in the middle of a dirt lot. There was a small wire fence around the perimeter, and a single dirt driveway leading up to the front steps. Mary unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The room smelled like floor wax and old paper. There were 2 rows of small wooden desks facing a large green chalkboard. Large windows lined the walls, letting in the bright morning sunlight and offering an unobstructed view of the empty landscape outside. Mary set her bag down on her desk at the front of the room, walked over to the windows, and pushed them open to let in some fresh air. Then she began preparing the chalkboard for the morning lessons, carefully writing out math equations and spelling words. By 8:30 in the morning, her students began to arrive. Because the area was so sparsely populated, Mary only had 6 students in total. All 6 of them were young girls ranging in age from 5 to 10 years old. They arrived in groups of 2 or 3, dropped off by their parents who were local farmers on their way to work. The girls ran up the wooden steps, chattering and laughing, and took their seats at the small wooden desks. Mary greeted each of them by name, asked them about their mornings, and then officially started the school day. For the first few hours, everything went exactly as it always did. The girls worked quietly on their math problems. You could hear the scratching of their pencils on the paper, the occasional rustle of a textbook page turning, and the sound of the wind blowing through the open windows. During recess, the girls went outside to play in the dirt lot while Mary sat on the front steps, keeping an eye on them and grading some papers. The heat of the day was really starting to build up, the kind of dry baking heat that makes the air shimmer above the ground. After recess, they all went back inside for reading time. The girls were seated at their desks, and Mary was standing up at the chalkboard, her back to the room, writing out a few final instructions for their assignment. The room was completely quiet, except for the tap, tap, tap of Mary's chalk on the board. And that was when Mary heard the sound of a heavy engine approaching. It was a loud, rumbling noise, and it was moving fast. Mary paused for a second. It was highly unusual for anyone to drive down this road in the middle of the day. The parents were all at work, and the mail carrier didn't come out this far. The engine sound got louder, and then Mary heard the distinct crunch of tires locking up on the gravel right outside the front of the school. She heard a vehicle door slam shut, then a second door slammed, and then she heard heavy, fast footsteps coming up the wooden stairs. Before Mary could even turn around, the heavy wooden front door flew open and slammed against the interior wall with a massive thud. Mary froze her hand, still gripping the small piece of white chalk against the blackboard. She turned her head and saw 2 men stepping into the room. Their faces were entirely covered by thick, dark masks with small holes cut out for the eyes. They were wearing heavy work clothes, and the taller of the 2 men was holding a double-barreled shotgun. He had the stock pressed against his shoulder, and the barrels were pointed directly at Mary's chest. The 6 young girls sitting at their desks instantly started screaming and crying. They scrambled out of their chairs and huddled together near the back wall. Mary immediately dropped the chalk, put her hands up in the air, and stepped sideways, so that her body was standing physically between the 2 men and the corner where the girls were crying. The taller man with the shotgun took a step forward and yelled at Mary, telling her to shut the kids up. Mary kept her hands up, and in a very calm, steady voice, she told the girls it was going to be okay, that they just needed to be quiet and listen. The girls continued to whimper, but they stopped screaming. The taller man then jerked the barrel of the shotgun toward the open doorway. He told Mary and the girls to get outside right now. He said if anyone tried to run, he would shoot. Mary didn't say a word. She just slowly lowered her hands, turned to the girls, and told them to line up and hold hands. The girls were crying again, but they did exactly what Mary asked. Mary walked at the front of the line, keeping herself between the men and the children, and they all marched out the front door and down the wooden steps. Sitting right in the middle of the dirt driveway was a large, bright red panel van. The back of the van had 2 solid metal doors and absolutely no windows. The shorter of the 2 masked men walked over to the back of the van, pulled open the 2 heavy metal doors, and stepped back. The taller man with the shotgun pointed the weapon at the dark opening and told Mary to get inside. Mary hesitated for a split second, looking out at the empty road, knowing there was absolutely no one around to help them. But with the gun pointed right at her students, she had no choice. She climbed up into the back of the dark van and then turned around to help the 6 little girls climb up after her. The girls were shaking, clutching tightly to Mary's dress and to each other. As soon as the last girl was inside, the shorter man slammed the 2 heavy metal doors shut. The inside of the van was instantly plunged into near total darkness. A few seconds later, Mary heard the distinct heavy rattling sound of a thick metal chain being wrapped around the handles of the back doors. And then she heard the heavy click of a large padlock snapping shut. They were locked in. Mary felt her way around the inside of the van. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, it was all solid bare metal. It smelled strongly of gasoline, old oil, and stale dust. There was a solid metal partition separating the back cargo area from the front cab, where the driver sat. Mary pressed her hands against the partition, feeling for any kind of gap or window, but it was completely sealed. A moment later, the van's engine roared to life. The vehicle lurched forward, throwing Mary and the girls off balance. They all huddled together on the hard metal floor as the van began to bounce and rattle violently over the unpaved dirt road. The drive felt like it lasted forever. In the back of the van, the temperature was rising rapidly. The hot Australian sun was beating down on the metal roof, turning the enclosed cargo space into an absolute oven. There was almost no air circulation. The girls were sweating profusely, their faces flushed and red in the dim light, filtering through the tiny cracks in the door seams. They were crying and asking Mary where they were going. Mary gathered them all into a tight circle, pulling them close to her. She spoke to them in a soft, reassuring voice. She told them stories, she had them sing songs with her. She did everything she could to distract them from the heat and the darkness. She tried to remain completely calm for their sake, but inside, she knew how serious this was. It was easily over 100 degrees inside that metal box, and they had absolutely no water. After what felt like several hours of driving over incredibly rough, uneven terrain, the van suddenly slowed down. Mary could feel the vehicle making a series of sharp, slow turns, as if the driver was navigating through dense trees or thick brush. And then the van came to a complete stop. The engine was cut off. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling exhaust pipe and the heavy, ragged breathing of the girls. Mary strained her ears, listening closely to the front of the van. She heard the front doors open and then slam shut. She heard the crunch of heavy boots walking on dry leaves and dirt. And then the footsteps slowly faded away into the distance until there was nothing but total, complete silence. Mary waited. She sat perfectly still in the sweltering darkness, listening for any sign of the men returning. 10 minutes passed, then 20 minutes, then an hour. No one came back. Mary carefully stood up her head, nearly touching the hot metal roof. She walked over to the back doors and pressed her ear against the metal. She didn't hear voices, she didn't hear cars, she didn't hear anything at all except the faint sound of wind blowing through trees. She pushed against the doors with her shoulder, but they didn't budge even a fraction of an inch. The chain and padlock on the outside were holding them completely tight. She walked to the metal partition, separating them from the front cab, and pounded on it with her fists, yelling out to see if anyone was in the driver's seat. No response. She ran her hands along the side panels of the van. It was just smooth, unbroken sheet metal. The heat inside the van was becoming unbearable. The air was incredibly thick and heavy, making it difficult to pull a full breath into her lungs. The 6 young girls were now lethargic, lying on the metal floor, their clothes completely soaked in sweat. Mary knew that if they stayed in this metal box for much longer, they were going to die from heat stroke and dehydration. She realized that whoever those men were, they were not coming back to let them out. If they were going to survive, she had to find a way to get them out of here herself. Based on police reports, witness statements, and crime scene analysis, here is a reconstruction of the events that followed. Mary stood in the center of the dark, suffocating van. She looked at the solid metal walls, knowing she had absolutely no tools, no weapons, and no leverage. But then she looked down at her feet. She was wearing those heavy leather boots. Mary sat down on the floor and quickly unlaced her right boot. She pulled it off her foot and gripped the soft leather upper section tightly in her hands. She turned the boot around so that the heavy, solid, thick wooden and leather heel was facing outward. She stood back up and moved over to the side wall of the van, right where a large, flat panel of sheet metal was welded to the interior frame. Mary took a deep breath, planted her left foot firmly on the floor, swung her arm back, and drove the heavy heel of her boot directly into the center of the metal panel with every single ounce of strength she had in her body. The impact produced a deafening, echoing clang inside the small space. The metal panel bowed outward ever so slightly, but it held firm. Mary didn't stop. She pulled her arm back and hit it again. And then again. And then again. She struck the exact same spot over and over, using her heavy boot like a makeshift sledgehammer. The physical exertion in the 100-degree heat was absolutely agonizing. Sweat poured down Mary's face, stinging her eyes. Her arm muscles burned with lactic acid, and her hands began to blister from gripping the rough leather of the boot, but she forced herself to keep swinging. Every time the heavy heel slammed into the side of the van, the metal panel dented just a little bit further outward. The 6 little girls sat up and watched in stunned silence as their teacher violently battered the side of the van. The noise was incredibly loud, but Mary told them to cover their ears and stay back. She swung the boot 50 times, 100 times, 200 times. The metal was slowly bending, warping, and pulling away from the rivets that held it to the frame. Mary's hands were bleeding now, and her breathing was ragged and shallow, but she refused to stop. She shifted her grip, squared her shoulders, and delivered another massive blow to the dented panel. This time, there was a sharp, distinct popping sound. One of the metal rivets had finally snapped. Seeing the small gap open up between the panel and the frame gave Mary a massive surge of adrenaline. She swung the boot again, hitting the metal right next to the broken rivet. Another pop, and then another. The side panel was starting to tear away from the van's structure. Mary dropped the boot, sat back down on the floor, raised her legs, and pressed the soles of her bare feet flat against the bent metal. She grabbed onto the floor ridges for leverage and pushed with both legs as hard as she could. The metal groaned, and then with a loud screeching sound, the entire lower half of the panel folded outward, creating a jagged rectangular hole about 2 feet wide right near the floor of the van. Fresh, slightly cooler air instantly rushed into the dark cargo space. Mary quickly scrambled over to the hole. The edges of the torn metal were incredibly sharp, so she took off her thick sweater and draped it over the bottom edge to protect the girls. She poked her head out the hole and looked around. The van was parked in a small, concealed clearing surrounded by incredibly dense, thick forest. There were no roads, no buildings, and no sign of the 2 masked men. Mary pulled her head back inside and told the girls it was time to go. One by one, she carefully guided the 6 children through the jagged hole, making sure none of them cut themselves on the metal. Once all the girls were outside, Mary grabbed her boots, squeezed herself through the opening, and dropped down onto the dirt. She quickly put her boots back on. The sun was getting low in the sky, casting long, dark shadows through the trees. Mary knew they had to get as far away from the van as possible before the men returned. She grabbed the hands of the 2 youngest girls, told the others to stay close, and they began running directly into the thick wilderness. They ran through heavy brush, pushing past low-hanging branches and stepping over massive fallen logs. The terrain was incredibly rough, and the girls were stumbling and tripping in the fading light. Their legs and arms were getting scratched by thorns, but Mary kept pushing them forward, constantly looking over her shoulder to see if they were being followed. They had been running for about 30 minutes when they suddenly heard a sound that made Mary stop in her tracks. It was the sound of voices, deep male voices calling out in the distance. Mary instantly dropped to her knees and pulled the 6 girls down with her hiding behind a thick cluster of bushes. She put her finger to her lips, telling the girls to be absolutely quiet. The voices were getting closer. Mary could hear the sound of boots crunching through the underbrush. She peeked through the leaves, her heart pounding in her chest, fully expecting to see the two masked men with the shotgun coming to finish the job. But as the figures emerged through the trees, Mary saw that they weren't wearing masks. They were wearing bright orange hunting vests, and they had hunting rifles slung casually over their shoulders. It was a group of local recreational hunters out looking for game. Mary burst out from behind the bushes, waving her arms and yelling for help. The hunters were completely shocked to see a young woman and 6 little girls covered in dirt and sweat emerging from the middle of nowhere. They immediately ran over, gave the group water from their canteens, and used their radio to contact the local authorities. It would turn out that the 2 men who had kidnapped Mary and her students were named Edwin John Eastwood and Robert Clyde Boland. When they had left the van parked deep in the woods, they had driven to a nearby town in a second vehicle to mail a massive ransom note to the state government of Victoria. They were demanding $1 million in exchange for the safe return of the teacher and the students. Eastwood and Boland had spent months planning the kidnapping. They had picked the Faraday State School because it was so isolated, and they had specifically reinforced the red panel van with heavy metal plating and heavy-duty chains because they wanted to ensure that there was absolutely no way anyone could escape from the inside. They had fully expected to collect their $1 million and disappear, completely confident that their hostages were secured. So you can imagine their absolute shock and humiliation when the news broke on the radio just a few hours later that their entire, massive, $1 million criminal plot had been completely destroyed because a 20-year-old teacher had simply taken off her shoe and kicked her way out of their impenetrable van. Because Mary Gibbs had managed to break herself and her students out, the police were able to secure the area and track down the kidnappers' movements. Edwin John Eastwood and Robert Clyde Boland were tracked down and arrested shortly after. Both men were convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. From the blistering dry heat of the Australian bush, we turn our attention to the cool ocean breezes of a California beach town, where a tragedy that devastated a community for nearly half a century would eventually be solved by a single drop of frozen evidence. On a bright Tuesday morning in July of 1973, 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe woke up in her bedroom in Newport Beach, California. She had spent the previous evening sitting on the piano bench, practicing her scales, while her parents watched television in the other room. It was just a completely standard, regular summer week. The sun was already shining through the window, and you could hear the faint sound of the ocean breeze rattling the palm fronds outside. Linda got out of bed and walked over to her closet to pick out her clothes for the day. She reached for her absolute favorite outfit. It was a white dress that her mother had made for her. Her mother was a skilled seamstress and had spent hours carefully stitching these delicate light blue flowers all over the fabric. Linda put the dress on, smoothed out the skirt, and went down to the kitchen for breakfast. Her mother and father were already at the table drinking coffee and getting ready for work. Her older sister was reading a magazine on the couch. Linda sat down, poured herself a bowl of cereal, and reminded her mother that she had summer school that morning. Her mother nodded and said she would drop her off on her way to work. But Linda would have to walk or ride her bike back home later because her mother had a busy afternoon schedule. Linda was perfectly fine with this. You know, Newport Beach was the kind of town where kids rode their bikes everywhere, cutting through neighbors' yards and walking down the sidewalks without anyone giving it a second thought. People left their front doors unlocked and their garage doors wide open all day long. So after finishing her cereal, Linda grabbed her school books, kissed her parents goodbye, and hopped into the passenger seat of her mother's car. The summer school classes were held at Richard Henry Dana Elementary, which was only a few miles from the O'Keefe house. Linda spent the morning sitting at a wooden desk working on math problems and reading assignments waiting for the bell to ring. When classes finally wrapped up around noon, the California sun was beating down hard on the pavement. The air was incredibly hot and heavy. Linda walked out of the school's front doors and headed toward the street. But instead of walking straight home, she went to the school's front office and used the rotary phone on the front desk to call her mother's office. When her mother answered, Linda asked if there was any way she could get a ride home, complaining that it was just too hot to walk today. Her mother sighed and explained that she was in the middle of a big project and could not leave the office. She told Linda to just take her time, walk in the shade, and go straight home. Linda was a little annoyed, but she hung up the phone, picked up her books, and started walking. A few blocks away, a woman named Janine was driving her car down Marguerite Drive, running errands. As Janine drove past an intersection near the school, she glanced out her passenger window and saw a young girl wearing a white dress with light blue flowers sitting on the concrete curb. The girl had her books resting on her lap and looked exhausted from the heat. But what really caught Janine's attention was the vehicle stopped right next to the girl. It was a large, boxy, turquoise-colored van. The passenger side door of the van was open, and a man was leaning over from the driver's seat, talking to the girl on the curb. Janine slowed her car down just a little bit, watching the interaction. The girl didn't look distressed or bothered at all. She was just talking back to the man. Janine figured it was probably a neighbor or a family friend offering the girl a ride home out of the hot sun. And so Janine pressed her foot back on the gas pedal and kept driving, turning the corner and leaving the turquoise van behind. Later that afternoon, Linda's mother pulled her car into the driveway of their home. She walked through the front door expecting to see Linda sitting on the couch watching television or practicing the piano. But the house was completely quiet. Her mother called out Linda's name, but nobody answered. She walked into the kitchen, but there were no dirty glasses in the sink. She checked Linda's bedroom, but her school books were not on the desk. Her mother felt a sudden sharp tightening in her chest. She picked up the kitchen phone and dialed the numbers of a few of Linda's friends who lived in the neighborhood. Every single parent who answered said the exact same thing. They had not seen Linda since summer school ended. The mother hung up the phone and walked out to the front yard, looking up and down the street. The sidewalks were empty. She got back into her car and retraced the exact route Linda would have taken from the elementary school to their house. She drove slowly, scanning the parks, the bus stops, and the sidewalks. She pulled her car over whenever she saw a group of kids riding their bicycles, rolling down her window to ask if any of them had seen Linda. But they all just shook their heads and pedaled away. The sun was getting lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. By dinner time, Linda's father arrived home from work. When he realized his daughter was missing, he immediately called the local police department. Within an hour, dozens of police officers and civilian volunteers were walking shoulder to shoulder through the streets of Newport Beach. They shined heavy flashlights into the bushes, checked the local beaches, and knocked on every single door within a 2-mile radius of the elementary school. Helicopters flew overhead, sweeping massive spotlights across the dark water of the bay. The police set up a command center and started taking statements from anyone who had seen Linda that day. That was when Janine, the woman who had been driving down Marguerite Drive, came forward. She sat down with a sketch artist and described the turquoise van she had seen stopped next to Linda. She described the man inside as a white male, possibly in his late 20s or early 30s. The police immediately broadcast this description over the radio, telling every patrol car in the county to pull over any turquoise van they saw. But as the night dragged on into the early hours of the morning, the radio stayed quiet. Nobody had seen the van, and nobody had seen Linda. The next morning, the sun came up over the Back Bay Nature Reserve, a large marshy area full of tall grass and muddy embankments not too far from the O'Keefe home. A local woman and her young son were walking along one of the dirt trails that cut through the reserve. The boy had brought a small bucket and a net, hoping to catch some frogs in the shallow water. As they walked down a steep embankment near a drainage ditch, the woman noticed something strange tangled in the thick reeds near the edge of the mud. She told her son to stay back, and she carefully stepped closer to get a better look. Through the tall green grass, she saw a piece of white fabric. As she took another step, she saw the fabric was covered in light blue hand-stitched flowers. The fabric was dirty and completely soaked with muddy water. And then she saw the shape beneath the fabric. It was a person lying at a very awkward angle, completely motionless. The woman grabbed her son's hand, turned around, and ran as fast as she could back up the trail to find a telephone. When the police arrived at the ditch, they roped off the entire nature reserve. Detectives climbed down into the mud and stood over the body of 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe. She was wearing the dress her mother had made for her. The detectives carefully examined the scene without moving her. They noted deep, dark bruising around her neck, indicating she had been violently strangled. There were heavy tire tracks pressed deep into the mud near the top of the embankment, completely matching the wheelbase of a large commercial van. And when the crime scene technicians carefully collected Linda's clothing, they found a very small biological sample left behind by the attacker. They swabbed the sample, placed it in a sterile glass vial, and transported it to the police evidence locker. Now, in 1973, DNA testing did not exist. The best the laboratory could do was determine the attacker's blood type. So the detectives took the vial, put it into a deep freeze storage unit, and hoped that one day science would catch up to the evidence. For the next several months, the Newport Beach Police Department ran a massive, exhausting investigation. They obtained the registration records for every single turquoise van in the state of California. Detectives drove hundreds of miles knocking on the doors of registered owners, inspecting their vehicles, and questioning their whereabouts on the day Linda disappeared. They found a man living 2 towns over who owned a turquoise van and had a history of bothering people at local parks. The detectives brought him into a small interrogation room, placed him in a hard wooden chair, and turned on a heavy reel-to-reel tape recorder. They questioned him for 10 hours straight. The man sweated profusely, his hands shaking as he stumbled over his words. And the detectives felt absolutely certain they had their guy. But 2 days later, his employer provided time cards and multiple eyewitnesses proving the man was working on a construction site 60 miles away during the exact window of time Linda was taken. He was a complete dead end. The police tracked down drifters, local workers, and delivery drivers. They followed up on hundreds of tips from the public, but every single lead dried up. The turquoise van had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth, and the man driving it was gone. Years turned into decades. The detectives who originally worked the case eventually packed up their desks and retired, handing the files over to younger officers who hadn't even been born when Linda disappeared. The O'Keefe family lived with an agonizing open wound, never knowing who had taken their daughter or why. Linda's photograph, a black and white school portrait of a smiling girl with missing teeth, remained pinned to the bulletin board inside the homicide detective's office. It was the first thing they saw when they walked in every morning, and the last thing they saw when they turned off the lights at night. The case file grew incredibly thick, filling up multiple cardboard boxes that collected dust in a metal storage cabinet. In the 1980s, when DNA technology began to emerge, detectives took that frozen vial out of storage and attempted to pull a profile, but the technology was still in its infancy, and the sample was too degraded to yield a clear result. The vial went back into the freezer. In the 1990s, they tried again, managing to pull a partial DNA profile, which they ran through the National Criminal Database. They waited for weeks, hoping for a match, but the computer returned 0 results. The killer was not in the system. It meant he had never been arrested for a major felony, or he had completely managed to fly under the radar of law enforcement for his entire life. The case went completely cold again. Now jump forward to the year 2019. 46 years had passed since Linda O'Keefe was found in that ditch. A new generation of detectives at the Newport Beach Police Department decided to try one last desperate tactic. They took the DNA sample, which had been perfectly preserved in the freezer for nearly half a century, and they sent it to a private laboratory that specialized in genetic genealogy. This was the same technology that everyday people use to find out where their ancestors came from by spitting into a tube and mailing it to a website. The laboratory extracted the killer's DNA and uploaded the genetic markers into a public genealogy database. They weren't looking for the killer himself. They were looking for anyone who shared his DNA, third cousins, second cousins, distant relatives who had willingly uploaded their own genetic profiles. A few days later, the computer produced a list of distant matches. A team of highly trained genealogists took those matches and began building massive family trees backward. They sifted through handwritten census records from the 1920s, faded marriage certificates, and old newspaper birth announcements. They had to trace the branches of the family backward generation by generation, until they found a common ancestor, and then they had to build the tree forward again following the lineage of every single male descendant who would have been in his late 20s or early 30s in the year 1973. The sprawling family tree slowly narrowed down. It eliminated dozens of men based on their age, their location, and their death records. Finally, the branches stopped at one specific leaf. The genealogist picked up the phone and called the Newport Beach Police Department. They gave the detectives a name, James Neal. The detectives immediately ran the name through their databases. They found a James Neal living a completely quiet, mundane life in Monument, Colorado. He was 72 years old, retired, and living in a modest house on a regular suburban street. He had no serious criminal record, But when the detectives dug deeper into his background, they found a detail that made their blood run cold. In the summer of 1973, James Neal had been living in Southern California, and at that time he worked in construction, a job that frequently required him to drive large commercial vans. The detectives didn't want to alert him, so they quietly flew a team out to Colorado. They parked in unmarked cars down the street from his house and waited. After a few days, they watched the 72-year-old man walk out of his front door, get into his car, and drive to a local fast food restaurant. He went inside, ordered some food, and sat at a table by himself. When he finished, he threw his trash away and walked out. The moment his car left the parking lot, the detectives rushed into the restaurant and pulled his discarded plastic water bottle out of the trash can. They put it in an evidence bag and rushed it to a laboratory. The DNA on the rim of the water bottle was a perfect astronomical match to the DNA found on Linda O'Keefe's white dress. Based on police reports, genetic evidence, and the geographical timeline here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on that hot July afternoon. The killer was driving his turquoise van through the residential streets of Newport Beach, likely just cruising around with the windows rolled down to beat the heat. As he turned onto Marguerite Drive, he saw a young girl sitting alone on the curb, looking tired and sweaty from her walk. He slowed the van down, pulled over to the side of the road, and opened the passenger door. He leaned across the seat and spoke to her, probably using a soft, friendly tone. He likely told her that it was far too hot for a walk and offered to drive her the rest of the way home. The girl, seeing just a normal-looking man offering a favor, stood up, dusted off her dress, and climbed into the passenger seat. The killer put the van in drive and pulled away from the curb. But he didn't drive toward her neighborhood. Instead, he drove directly toward the Back Bay Nature Reserve. Once they were parked in the tall reeds completely hidden from the main road, his demeanor violently changed. When she tried to fight back, he overpowered her, wrapping his hands tightly around her neck until she stopped moving. He then dragged her out of the van, rolled her down the steep, muddy embankment into the drainage ditch, and drove away, believing he had completely gotten away with it. And for 46 years, he did. He moved to another state, grew old, and lived a peaceful life, completely unaware that a microscopic drop of his own biology was sitting in a frozen vial, waiting for the future to arrive. In February of 2019, police officers knocked on the front door of that quiet home in Colorado. James Neal was arrested and extradited back to California to stand trial for murder. Before a jury could determine his final fate, he contracted an illness and died while in police custody, bringing an end to a case that had devastated a beach community for nearly half a century. From a sun-drenched coastal town where modern science finally shattered a 46-year-old mystery, we move across the world to the dark, freezing shadows of a German cemetery where an entirely different kind of monster was stalking. The grounds searching for something much older and much more dangerous. In early January of 1972, a man named Elias woke up in the pitch black of his small apartment in Nuremberg, Germany. He rolled out of bed, walked into his narrow kitchen, and put a metal kettle on the stove. While the water heated up, he went to the closet and pulled out a thick wool sweater, a heavy canvas coat, and a pair of thick leather work boots. Elias was the head groundskeeper for one of the largest and oldest cemeteries in the city, and for the past 20 years, his morning routine had been exactly the same. He poured his black coffee into a thermos, grabbed his ring of heavy brass keys, and walked out into the freezing morning air. The walk to the cemetery took about 15 minutes. There were no cars on the road, and the streetlights cast long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered pavement. When Elias reached the main entrance of the cemetery, he unlocked the massive wrought iron gates and pushed them open. The hinges let out a loud metallic squeal that echoed across the rows of granite headstones. Elias stepped inside, locked the gate behind him, and began his morning patrol. He always walked the entire perimeter of the property before the sun came up, checking the stone walls and the iron fences for any signs of vandalism or trespassers from the night before. He walked slowly, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen grass. After about 30 minutes of walking through the dark, silent rows of graves, Elias arrived at a small, low-slung stone building situated at the very back edge of the property. This was the cemetery morgue. It was a holding area where bodies were kept overnight after being prepared by the morticians waiting for the funeral services the following day. Elias pulled the heavy ring of keys from his pocket and stepped up to the thick wooden double doors. But as he reached out to slide the key into the iron padlock, his hand stopped in midair. The padlock was not on the door. It was lying on the concrete step near the toe of his boot, and the thick metal loop had been completely severed by a pair of heavy bolt cutters. Elias stood perfectly still for a second. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the dark tree line that bordered the back of the cemetery, but he did not see anything moving. He looked back at the wooden double doors. One of them was pushed inward, just a fraction of an inch. Elias reached out, placed his hand flat against the cold wood, and pushed. The door swung open and hit the interior stone wall with a loud thud. He stepped inside the pitch-black room and felt along the wall until his fingers brushed against the light switch. He flipped it up. A row of pale fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, buzzing softly. Elias looked toward the center of the room, and he instantly backed away, his hand covering his mouth. There were 3 stainless steel tables bolted to the floor in the middle of the room. The day before, 3 bodies had been wash-dressed and respectfully laid out under white linen sheets. Now those sheets were thrown in crumpled piles in the corners of the room. The bodies were completely exposed, and they had been violently mutilated. Deep, jagged incisions covered their chests and arms. But as Elias looked closer, he realized something else. The stone floor beneath the steel tables was covered in large, dark puddles of blood, but the puddles were not natural. There were wide streaks smeared across the stone leading toward the center of the puddles, as if someone had spent hours in this freezing room on their hands and knees, desperately trying to scoop the blood up and funnel it into some sort of container. Elias ran out of the building, sprinted all the way back to the groundskeeper's shed, and used the rotary phone to call the police. Within an hour, the cemetery was swarming with detectives and crime scene technicians. A lead investigator named Detective Weber walked through the morgue, carefully stepping over the smears on the floor. He instructed his team to check the bodies for missing items. But when the technicians finished their sweep, they reported that absolutely nothing of monetary value had been taken. Gold wedding bands were still on the fingers of the deceased. Gold fillings were still in their teeth. Silver necklaces had not been touched. The coroner arrived shortly after and examined the deep lacerations on the bodies. He pulled Detective Weber aside and pointed to the specific angles of the cuts. He explained that these were not random acts of vandalism. The incisions had been made with a very sharp blade, specifically positioned over major arteries. Whoever had broken into this room had done so with the singular goal of harvesting the blood from the corpses. Over the next 2 months, this exact same scenario played out 4 more times at different cemeteries scattered across Nuremberg. The police were dealing with an absolute nightmare. They organized a massive covert dragnet across the city. Every single night, dozens of police officers in plain clothes were dispatched to various graveyards. They sat in freezing, unheated maintenance sheds for 12 hours at a time. They parked unmarked cars in the dark alleys behind cemetery walls, drinking bad coffee from thermoses, staring through binoculars until the sun came up. But the intruder never appeared where the police were waiting. He seemed to know exactly which cemeteries were unguarded on any given night, slipping in, breaking the locks, mutilating the bodies, taking the blood, and slipping back out without leaving a single fingerprint or a dropped tool behind. The local newspapers eventually got a hold of the leaked police reports. They printed massive front-page headlines calling the unknown intruder the Vampire of Nuremberg. The citizens of the city reacted immediately. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and heavy window latches. People stopped walking their dogs near the graveyards. The streets emptied out as soon as the sun went down. By late May of 1972, the weather in Nuremberg had finally turned warm. It was a Friday night, and a young man in his early 20s was sitting in a booth at a local diner in the city center with his girlfriend. They had spent the last hour eating burgers and talking about their week. The diner was brightly lit and full of people. When they finished their food, the young man paid the bill, and they walked outside to his small blue sedan parked by the curb. He opened the passenger door for her, closed it, and walked around to the driver's side. He started the engine, rolled down his window to let the warm spring air in, and pulled away from the curb. They drove out of the crowded city center, navigating through the traffic lights and the illuminated storefronts, heading toward the rural outskirts of the city. After about 20 minutes, the paved road ended and transitioned into gravel. The streetlights vanished, leaving only the yellow beams of the car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The young man steered the car onto a narrow, rutted dirt path that led deep into a dense patch of woods. This area was a well-known spot for young couples from the city to go and get some privacy away from their parents. He drove slowly, the tires kicking up a cloud of dry dust in the taillights. He eventually pulled the car off the dirt path and parked it under the heavy, low-hanging branches of a massive oak tree. He reached forward and turned the headlights off. The woods were plunged into total, absolute blackness. He left the key in the ignition, turned to the accessory position, so the dashboard gauges glowed with a faint green light, and the radio continued to play soft music through the car's small speakers. He rolled his window down a few more inches, unbuckled his seatbelt, and turned to his girlfriend. They sat there for about 15 minutes, talking in low voices. The only sounds outside the car were the wind moving through the upper branches of the trees and the occasional chirp of insects. And then the young man heard a sound. It was a heavy, distinct crunch, like a leather boot stepping squarely onto a dry branch. The young man stopped mid-sentence. He sat up straight and leaned his head toward the open driver's side window. He peered out into the woods, trying to see past the frame of the car. But the canopy of leaves above them was so incredibly thick that it blocked out the moonlight entirely. The woods were just a solid, impenetrable wall of black. He held his breath and listened. 10 seconds passed, then 20. He did not hear another footstep. He did not hear any rustling in the brush. He exhaled, leaned back in his seat, and told his girlfriend it was probably just a stray dog or a deer moving through the trees. He smiled at her and started talking again. And then a man simply stepped out of the black tree line and stood directly next to the driver's side door. The young man flinched his shoulder, slamming into the B-pillar of the car. The stranger did not say a word. He did not knock on the metal. He just stood there, completely still, looking down into the cabin of the car through the open window. The faint green light from the dashboard illuminated the bottom half of the stranger's face, but his eyes were hidden in the shadows. The young man could see that the stranger's right arm was hanging down by his side, and his hand was gripping a heavy piece of dark metal. The young man swallowed hard. He reached his left hand out toward the interior door handle, intending to open the door and ask the man what he wanted. But before his fingers even brushed the plastic handle, the stranger raised his right arm. He pointed the barrel of a heavy-caliber handgun directly at the glass of the driver's window and pulled the trigger. The mechanical explosion inside the small, enclosed cabin of the car was absolutely deafening. The driver's side window shattered into thousands of tiny square fragments that sprayed across the dashboard and the seats. Both the young man and his girlfriend were struck instantly by the gunfire. Based on police reports, forensic evidence, and crime scene analysis, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened next. The man standing outside the car with the gun was a 39-year-old local resident named Kuno Hoffman. Kuno had lived his entire life with a very severe, debilitating speech impediment. He possessed a heavy stutter that made it nearly impossible for him to communicate normally with other people. He was a deeply isolated and disturbed individual who spent all of his time locked in his apartment reading bizarre mythology and occult texts. Over the years, Kuno had convinced himself of a very specific, absolute delusion. He believed that if he consumed human blood, it would alter his physical composition, grant him supernatural strength, and completely cure his stutter. In the beginning, he had targeted the cemeteries. He would break into the morgues in the dead of night, mutilate the prepared bodies, and spend hours scooping their cold blood into glass jars to take back to his apartment and drink. But by May of 1972, Kuno had decided that the dead were no longer enough. The blood of corpses was not curing his speech impediment. He convinced himself that he needed fresh, warm blood. He needed to take it directly from the living. So he purchased a handgun. He walked out of his apartment, navigated to the edge of the city, and crept into the dense woods near the Lover's Lane. He stood in the pitch-black tree line and waited for a car to pull up and turn off its headlights. After Kuno fired the shots into the car, the noise echoed for miles. He stepped back from the vehicle, turned, and disappeared back into the thick brush. Inside the car, the young man was bleeding heavily from his wounds, and his ears were ringing intensely, but he realized the shooter had retreated. Operating purely on adrenaline, the young man slammed his foot on the clutch, reached down, grabbed the gear shift, and shoved the car into drive. He stomped on the gas pedal. The rear tires spun violently in the dirt, kicking up rocks before catching traction. The car lurched forward, tearing out of the woods and onto the paved road. He drove the car at maximum speed, running through stop signs and intersections until he slammed on the brakes directly in front of the emergency room doors of a local hospital. Both he and his girlfriend were pulled from the bullet-riddled car and rushed into emergency surgery. They both survived. When Detective Weber arrived at the hospital a few hours later, he sat down with the young man. The young man gave a detailed physical description of the silent shooter. The detectives at the precinct looked at the timeline. They realized that the morgue break-ins had abruptly stopped the exact same week. This unprovoked, highly violent shooting occurred in the woods. They formed a task force to search for a suspect who fit the description and had a history of trespassing or highly unusual behavior. The massive dragnet eventually led them to the apartment of Kuno Hoffman. When heavily armed police officers kicked down his front door, they found Kuno sitting quietly inside. The apartment was littered with physical evidence, tying him directly to the broken padlocks at the cemeteries, the tools used to mutilate the bodies, and the firearm used in the shooting at the Lover's Lane. Kuno Hoffman was arrested and placed in handcuffs. He was charged and convicted of double attempted murder and multiple counts of desecration of the dead. He was sentenced to life in a high-security psychiatric prison. From the dark, bullet-riddled woods of Germany, where a man hunted the living to satisfy a terrible delusion, we move to the vast, open expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where a family's wooden boat is about to be destroyed, forcing 6 people into a brutal, agonizing fight for their lives. On a very warm and humid morning in the middle of June of 1972, 48-year-old Dougal Robertson woke up inside the narrow master cabin of his wooden schooner. The air below the deck was thick and sticky, carrying the permanent heavy scent of old diesel-fueled damp canvas and ocean salt. Dougal sat up on the edge of his small bunk, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened closely to the familiar rhythmic creak of the wooden hull pushing through the water. He reached for his clothes, dressed quietly in the dim light, and climbed the short wooden ladder up to the main deck to start his day. And living full-time on a 43-foot wooden boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is not exactly a luxury vacation. Every single square inch of the vessel had a specific purpose, and the space was incredibly tight for a family of 6. Dougal walked across the damp wooden planks of the deck, feeling the gentle roll of the ocean beneath his feet. He checked the rigging, running his calloused hands over the thick ropes to make sure nothing had frayed during the night. The horizon stretched out in every single direction, just a massive, unbroken circle of deep blue water meeting a pale blue sky. Down below in the small galley kitchen, Dougal's wife Lynn was already awake and preparing breakfast. She stood braced against the small counter, using her hips to balance herself against the constant rocking motion of the boat. She pumped fresh water from a small hand sink into a metal pot and struck a match to light the small propane stove. The smell of cooking oats and instant coffee soon drifted up through the open hatch, mixing with the sharp smell of the sea air. Lynn carefully portioned out the food into 6 small plastic bowls, always keeping a very close eye on exactly how much of their dry provisions they were using each day. So shortly after the smell of food filled the cabin, the 4 children began to wake up in their cramped sleeping quarters. The oldest son, Douglas, who was 18, climbed out of his hammock and immediately started helping his mother carry the bowls up to the main deck. His sister Anne and the younger twin boys, Neil and Sandy, followed right behind him. The family sat together on the wooden benches near the steering wheel, eating their warm oats in relative silence. There were no other ships anywhere in sight. There was no radio chatter. It was just the 6 of them, and the steady sound of the wind filling the large white sails above their heads. After breakfast, the daily routine began, and Dougal ran a very tight ship. He was an experienced sailor and a very demanding father, who expected everyone to pull their weight. The twin boys were handed heavy bristle brushes and told to scrub the salt residue off the deck planks. Anne went down below to carefully wash the breakfast dishes using a minimal amount of fresh water. While Douglas took his position near the helm to monitor their heading, Dougal went down to the small navigation desk, pulling out his charts and a pencil to calculate their current position based on the speed of the wind and the angle of the sun. They were currently sailing roughly 200 miles west of the Galapagos Islands, moving steadily across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. For the first few hours of the morning, everything went exactly as it always did. The temperature rose steadily, turning the wooden deck hot to the touch. The boys finished their scrubbing and sat in the shade of the mainsail reading paperback books. Lynn was below deck, organizing the small medical kit she kept stocked, relying on her background as a nurse to make sure they were prepared for minor injuries. The ocean was relatively calm, with only small rolling waves gently lifting and dropping the heavy wooden hull. But right around mid-morning, the quiet routine of the boat was completely shattered. A massive, heavy thud echoed through the timber of the ship, striking the hull right beneath the waterline. The impact was so strong that the entire 43-foot schooner shuddered violently, throwing Dougal hard against the navigation desk. Up on the deck, the boys were tossed to the wooden floorboards, and Lynn dropped the medical supplies she had been holding. The sound was not a scrape like hitting a coral reef. It was a dull, localized impact, like a heavy battering ram, slamming directly into the side of the boat. Dougal instantly scrambled up the wooden ladder to the main deck, yelling out to his family to ask if everyone was all right. Before anyone could even answer a second, even more violent impact struck the vessel. This time, the distinct, sharp sound of splintering pine echoed loudly from the lower section of the hull. Dougal ran to the edge of the deck and leaned heavily over the wooden railing. Peering down into the dark blue water to see what they had hit, and right beneath the surface, moving incredibly fast, he saw several massive, sleek, black and white shapes circling the boat. It was a pod of killer whales. They were enormous, weighing several tons each, and they were intentionally ramming their heavy bodies directly into the wooden planks of the schooner. Another heavy thud struck the stern, and Dougal heard the undeniable, terrifying sound of heavy water rushing into the lower cabin. He spun around and yelled down the open hatch, telling Lynn to check the bilge. Lynn dropped to her knees in the galley and pulled up one of the wooden floorboards. Cold, dark seawater was already flooding into the bottom of the boat, rising incredibly fast, swirling around the canned goods and spare ropes stored in the lower compartments. The whales struck the boat again, and the sound of cracking wood was deafening. The hull was completely compromised. Dougal looked at the speed of the water rushing in and knew instantly that the boat was not going to survive. He yelled to his wife and children to abandon ship. He ordered Douglas to grab the small, inflatable life raft stored near the front of the deck and told Lynn to gather whatever survival supplies she could carry. The deck of the boat was already starting to tilt heavily to one side, as the weight of the incoming ocean dragged the wooden hull down. Now inside the sinking cabin, the water was already up to Lynn's knees. She waded through the swirling mess, grabbing a small yellow emergency grab bag, a box of flares, and a small, heavy sack of raw onions that was floating near the galley counter. She also grabbed a single large plastic jug of fresh water. She waded back to the ladder, the water now reaching her waist, and pushed the supplies up through the hatch to her children. The boat was groaning under the immense pressure, the wooden beams snapping and popping as the structure began to give way to the ocean. Up on the deck, Douglas and Dougal had thrown the small inflatable life raft into the water and pulled the ripcord. The yellow rubber raft hissed loudly as it expanded, bobbing violently on the waves right next to the sinking schooner. They also untied a tiny 9-foot fiberglass dinghy that they kept lashed to the deck for short trips to shore, tethering it to the inflatable raft. Dougal yelled for his family to jump. One by one, the 4 children and Lynn climbed over the wooden railing and dropped down into the yellow inflatable raft, clutching the small pile of supplies they had managed to save. Dougal was the last person to leave the ship. He stood on the deck, the water now washing directly over his shoes, and took one final look at the boat that had been their entire home. He stepped over the railing and dropped down into the life raft next to his family. Less than 3 minutes after the very first impact from the killer whales, the heavy wooden schooner slipped entirely beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The water bubbled and churned for a few seconds, leaving behind a small slick of diesel fuel, a few floating pieces of broken wood, and nothing else. The 6 members of the family were now completely alone, adrift in a massive ocean sitting in a small inflatable raft and a tiny fiberglass dinghy. The killer whales had vanished back into the deep water just as quickly as they had appeared. The sudden silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of the wind and the water slapping against the thin rubber of the raft. Dougal took a quick inventory of exactly what they had managed to get off the boat. They had the emergency grab bag, some flares, a few basic tools, a sharp knife, a bag of onions, and enough fresh water to last the 6 of them for exactly 3 days. For the first few days, the reality of their situation set in very slowly. The inflatable raft had a thin canopy that provided some shade, but the heat inside was incredibly intense. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their knees pulled up to their chests in the cramped space. Dougal established a very strict rationing system immediately. Each person was allowed only a tiny sip of water twice a day. To supplement their fluid intake, he handed out the raw onions. They peeled the dry, papery skin off the onions and chewed the sharp, strong-tasting flesh, swallowing the harsh juices to keep their mouths from drying out completely. But the ocean is a relentless environment, and things began to degrade very quickly. The constant exposure to the salt water, began to cause painful red sores on their skin. The children were quiet, leaning against their parents, lethargic from the heat and the lack of food. And the inflatable raft, which was their primary shelter, was not designed for long-term survival. The harsh ultraviolet rays from the sun began to weaken the yellow rubber, and the constant friction of the waves slowly wore away at the seams. After just a little over a week, the raft began to leak air. Dougal spent hours every day using a small manual hand pump to force air back into the deflating tubes, but the leaks were getting worse. To make matters even more tense, the ocean beneath them was teeming with predators. Large oceanic white-tip sharks began to circle the raft, bumping their heavy, rough snouts against the soft rubber underside. The family could feel the solid thuds of the sharks through the thin floor, a constant physical reminder of exactly what was waiting for them in the water. They had to sit perfectly still, trying not to provoke the animals swimming just inches beneath them. By the 17th day, the inflatable raft was completely failing. The rubber was so degraded and torn that it was taking on water faster than they could bail it out. Dougal made the incredibly difficult decision to abandon the inflatable raft entirely. He pulled the tiny 9-foot fiberglass dinghy closer, and one by one, the 6 family members carefully transferred over to it. This dinghy was absolutely not meant to hold 6 people. They had to sit in a very specific interlocking formation just to keep the small boat balanced. If anyone leaned too far to the left or the right, the edge of the dinghy would dip below the waterline, threatening to flood the boat completely. In the dinghy, they had absolutely no canopy and no protection from the elements. The midday sun beat directly down on their unprotected shoulders, blistering their skin and causing their lips to split and bleed with every breath. Their 3-day supply of water had been completely gone for weeks. They had managed to collect a small amount of rainwater during a passing storm, but it was nowhere near enough. Their tongues were swollen, their eyes were sunken, and their bodies were rapidly shutting down from severe dehydration. They had no fishing gear, and the fish in the open ocean stayed far below the surface, well out of reach. They were dying, and Dougal knew that if they did not find a source of fluid within the next few days, none of them would survive. They had completely exhausted their onions, their rainwater, and their physical reserves. They had to transition from being passive victims, waiting for a rescue, to becoming active predators in order to sustain their own lives. Based on verified maritime incident archives and the detailed logbooks kept during the ordeal, here is a reconstruction of the extreme measures taken to survive on the open water. The sun was high and blindingly bright when a large, heavy shape broke the surface of the water just a few yards from the fiberglass dinghy. It was a massive sea turtle weighing nearly 100 pounds, its thick shell glistening in the light as it paddled slowly through the gentle waves. The person sitting near the bow of the dinghy immediately signaled to the others, pointing a trembling, blistered finger at the animal. Slowly and completely silently, the dinghy was paddled closer to the resting turtle. Nobody made a sound. Every single movement was calculated, keeping the small boat perfectly balanced so it would not rock and scare the animal away. When the side of the dinghy was directly next to the turtle, a pair of raw, sunburnt hands reached quickly over the fiberglass edge. The hands slammed down onto the back of the turtle's thick shell, gripping the slippery, hard edge with a desperate, frantic strength. The turtle immediately panicked, thrashing its heavy flippers against the water, churning the surface into a white foam. The sheer weight and power of the animal threatened to pull the person right over the side into the shark-infested water, but another set of hands grabbed on, digging their fingers under the rim of the shell. Together, leaning their weight backward into the center of the tiny boat to maintain balance, they hauled the heavy thrashing animal up and over the side. The turtle hit the bottom of the dinghy with a loud, heavy thud. There was no time for hesitation. A sharp survival knife was instantly driven into the soft tissue of the turtle's neck. The animal struggled violently for a few moments, its thick claws scratching against the fiberglass before finally going still. The knife was then used to carefully widen the incision, exposing the major arteries. In a state of profound, life-threatening dehydration, water is not the only fluid that can keep a human body functioning. One by one, each person in the boat leaned down over the bottom of the dinghy. They pressed their cracked, bleeding lips directly against the open wound on the animal's neck and drank the warm, dark, thick blood as it pooled. The taste was harsh, metallic, and heavy with salt. But they swallowed it greedily. The blood provided the vital hydration and protein their failing organs desperately needed to keep working. After the blood was consumed, the knife was used to carefully butcher the rest of the animal, cutting the raw meat into thin, ragged strips. So, for the next several weeks, this brutal process became their entire existence. They caught several more turtles using their bare hands, hauling them into the tiny boat to drink their blood. They took the thin strips of raw turtle meat and draped them over the wooden oars and the edges of the fiberglass dinghy, letting the intense baking heat of the sun dry the meat into a tough, leathery jerky. They chewed on the dried meat slowly, letting the saliva break it down in their mouths. They also managed to catch flying fish that occasionally landed in the boat by mistake, eating them completely raw, bones and all. The physical condition of the family was catastrophic. Their clothes had essentially rotted right off their bodies due to the constant salt water and friction. Their skin was covered in deep, weeping saltwater boils, and their muscles had completely atrophied from lack of movement. They spent their days sitting in the bottom of a boat that was constantly filled with a few inches of bloody, foul-smelling seawater mixed with turtle remains. But despite the unimaginable suffering, their strict discipline and the turtle blood kept them breathing. They tracked the passing days by scratching small marks into the fiberglass hull with the tip of the knife. On the 38th day of their ordeal, the ocean was relatively calm. The family was huddled together in the bottom of the tiny boat, mostly silent, conserving what little energy they had left. Suddenly, Lynn lifted her head and squinted out at the horizon. A small, dark shape was breaking the flat blue line where the sky met the water. As minutes passed, the shape grew larger and more defined. It was the heavy steel bow of a massive ship pushing a white wave of water ahead of it. It was a Japanese fishing trawler, the Tokamaru II, and it was heading directly toward their position. Dougal grabbed the last remaining flare from their emergency bag. His hands were shaking violently as he struck the cap, igniting a bright, hissing red flame that smoked heavily into the clear sky. He waved the flare back and forth, praying that someone on the bridge of the massive steel ship was looking in their direction. The trawler continued its steady pace, and for a terrifying minute, it seemed like it might just pass them by. But then the low, heavy blast of the ship's horn echoed across the water, vibrating in the chests of the family. The trawler slowed its massive engines, reversing, and slowly angled its high steel hull right alongside the tiny, blood-stained dinghy. The crew of the Japanese trawler threw down heavy rope nets and quickly climbed down to assist the family. The 6 people in the dinghy were so physically broken and weak that they could not even stand up on their own. They had to be carefully lifted out of the dinghy and hoisted up onto the metal deck of the trawler. When the crew of the ship saw the condition of the survivors and looked down at the tiny 9-foot fiberglass boat littered with dried turtle shells and bones, they were completely stunned. The Robertson family was given fresh water, warm food, and medical attention as the trawler immediately changed course for the nearest port. Following a massive debriefing with maritime authorities, it was officially recorded that the entire family of 6 had survived for 38 continuous days adrift in the Pacific Ocean after their schooner was destroyed. Dougal Robertson later published his detailed logbooks documenting the exact physical and psychological toll of their ordeal, establishing one of the most thoroughly verified and extreme survival accounts in modern maritime history. From the vast, endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where a family fought the brutal elements to stay alive, we moved to the cold, rigid concrete walls of a maximum security prison yard in Ireland, where a completely different kind of escape was about to fall right out of the sky. On the morning of October 31st, 1973, a prison officer named Liam woke up in his small brick row house on the north side of Dublin, Ireland. The sky outside his bedroom window was a heavy, flat gray, and a cold rain was just starting to hit the glass. Liam got out of bed, walked into his narrow kitchen, and put a metal kettle on the stove. While he waited for the water to boil, he went to the small closet near the front door and pulled out his heavy, dark wool uniform. He spent 10 minutes using a stiff brush to remove any lint or dust from the fabric, and then he grabbed a tin of black polish. He sat at his kitchen table and worked the polish into the leather of his boots in small, tight circles until the boots reflected the yellow light from the overhead bulb. You know Liam took his job very seriously. He was a senior officer at Mountjoy Prison, which was the largest and most secure correctional facility in the entire country. After he finished his tea and ate a slice of toasted bread, Liam put on his heavy coat, grabbed his lunch pail, and walked out into the wet morning air. The walk to the prison took about 20 minutes, taking him down a series of narrow cobblestone streets lined with tall brick buildings. When he arrived at the main gate of Mountjoy, he showed his identification to the guard in the watchtower. The heavy iron gates slowly rolled open, the metal wheels grinding loudly against the stone tracks. Liam stepped inside the massive limestone walls, and the gates shut behind him with a heavy final thud. He walked across the main courtyard, feeling the cold wind blowing off the nearby Irish Sea, and headed straight to the guard locker room to check in for his shift. So Liam was assigned to supervise the D-Wing exercise yard that day. Now, Mountjoy Prison housed all sorts of criminals, but the D-Wing was specifically designated for political prisoners, meaning it held high-ranking members of the Provisional IRA. These were men who had been involved in highly organized, highly violent activities, and they operated inside the prison with a strict military hierarchy. As Liam walked out into the exercise yard, he could see the prisoners already out there. There were about 200 men in the yard, all wearing coarse denim jackets and heavy boots. They didn't yell or run around. Instead, they walked in tight, organized circles around the perimeter of the yard. They stood in groups of 3 or 4, keeping their voices low. Whenever Liam or another guard walked past, the prisoners would completely stop talking, staring straight ahead until the guard was at least 10 paces away. The gravel crunched steadily under their boots, creating a constant rhythmic sound that echoed off the high stone walls. Liam pulled a heavy brass pocket watch from his vest. The glass was scratched, but he could clearly read the hands. It was coming up on 3:30. He snapped the metal lid shut and slipped it back into his pocket. He just had to stand out here in the cold for another hour before the yard period ended, and he could go back inside to the heated break room. He rubbed his gloved hands together and stamped his boots on the ground to keep the feeling in his toes. Earlier that same morning, about 10 miles away, at a small civilian airfield on the outskirts of Dublin, a commercial helicopter pilot named Captain Arthur Thompson was preparing for a job. Arthur walked around his Alouette 2 helicopter, running his hands over the metal fuselage and checking the fluid levels. The air in the hangar smelled heavily of aviation fuel and old grease. Arthur liked these morning flights. He spent most of his time ferrying corporate executives around or doing agricultural surveys, but today he had a photography job. A man who called himself Mr. Hess had booked the helicopter a few days prior, paying in advance with crisp, clean cash. Hess had claimed he was a location scout for an American film production company, and he needed to take some low-altitude aerial photographs of the Irish countryside for a new movie. Around 9 in the morning, Mr. Hess arrived at the airfield. He was a tall man wearing a heavy wool overcoat and carrying a large leather satchel that presumably held his camera equipment. He shook Arthur's hand, his grip very firm, and then climbed into the passenger seat of the helicopter. Arthur climbed into the pilot's seat, put on his headset, and began flipping the overhead switches to start the engine. The massive rotor blades slowly began to turn, picking up speed until the thumping noise became a continuous, deafening roar. Arthur pulled back on the cyclic stick, and the helicopter lifted off the tarmac, pitching forward and flying out toward the rolling green hills west of the city. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. Arthur flew the helicopter at about 1,000 feet, pointing out the winding path of the River Liffey and the dark patchwork squares of the farmland below. The helicopter vibrated steadily, the glass bubble of the cockpit offering a wide, unobstructed view of the horizon. But then, as they were flying over a very remote, densely wooded area known as the Wicklow Mountains, Arthur noticed that Mr. Hess had not taken his camera out of his satchel. He hadn't even unbuckled the leather straps. Arthur turned his head to ask if he wanted to fly lower to get a better angle or if he needed to hover over a specific clearing. But when he looked over, Mr. Hess was not looking out the window anymore. He had reached into his heavy wool overcoat and pulled out a dark metal revolver, and he was pressing the cold steel barrel directly against the side of Arthur's neck. Arthur completely froze his hands, gripping the flight controls tightly. Mr. Hess did not yell. He leaned over his mouth right next to Arthur's headset microphone, and he gave Arthur a very specific set of new coordinates to fly to. He told Arthur that if he altered the altitude, if he tried to key the radio to call for help, or if he deviated from the heading by even a single degree, he would pull the trigger. Arthur swallowed hard, nodded his head, and banked the helicopter sharply to the east, heading directly back toward the center of Dublin. Back at Mountjoy Prison, it was now approaching 3:40 in the afternoon. Liam was standing near the center of the exercise yard, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the prisoners walk their laps. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a solid, flat sheet of gray. Suddenly, a faint, rhythmic thumping noise cut through the sound of the wind. Liam tilted his head, listening. The noise grew louder and deeper. Several of the prisoners stopped walking and looked up at the sky. A few seconds later, a small, dark dot appeared over the southern wall of the prison. It was a helicopter. Liam watched as the helicopter flew directly over the prison, the loud thumping of the rotor blades vibrating in his chest. It banked sharply and began to circle the facility. This was highly unusual. Civilian aircraft were strictly forbidden from flying this low over a maximum security prison. Liam walked over to the senior officer on duty, a man named Chief Ward, and asked him if they were expecting a delivery or a medical transport. Chief Ward kept his eyes on the helicopter and shook his head. He told Liam that there had been a rumor going around the staff room all week that the Irish Minister for Defense was doing a series of unannounced surprise inspections of the country's penal facilities. Ward explained that the minister was reportedly very concerned about the security protocols regarding political prisoners and wanted to see firsthand how the staff handled emergency lockdowns and yard control. Ward said this must be the minister right now, dropping in from the sky to see how quickly the guards reacted to an unexpected arrival. He ordered Liam to make sure his uniform was perfectly straight and to stand at attention. And so the helicopter circled the prison a second time, and then it suddenly dropped its nose and began to descend directly toward the D-Wing exercise yard. Chief Ward immediately pulled a silver whistle from his chest pocket and blew a long, sharp blast. He yelled at the guards to get the prisoners back. Liam and the other officers quickly moved forward, waving their wooden batons and ordering the 200 prisoners to clear the center of the yard and form a tight perimeter against the stone walls. Surprisingly, the prisoners did not argue or drag their feet. They moved quickly, pressing their backs against the cold limestone, leaving a massive open circle of gravel right in the middle of the yard. Liam and the other guards then moved to the edge of the cleared circle. Following Chief Ward's lead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, straightening their ties and brushing the dust off their lapels. They stood completely at attention, forming a neat, respectful, welcoming line. They were fully prepared to salute a high-ranking government official. The helicopter came down fast. The massive downdraft from the rotor blades kicked up a blinding cloud of dust, loose gravel, and dry leaves. Liam had to squint his eyes and turn his face slightly away from the stinging debris, holding his hand over his cap to keep it from blowing off his head. The noise was absolutely deafening, echoing violently off the 4 stone walls that enclosed the yard. The helicopter hovered for just a second, its landing skids hovering just inches above the ground. The wind from the blades was so intense that several of the prisoners in the back rows had to physically turn away and shield their faces. And then it touched down heavily on the gravel, right in front of the line of guards. The engine whined loudly, the rotors continuing to spin at full speed. Liam stood perfectly straight, his chin up, his hands firmly at his sides, waiting for the passenger door to open. He fully expected to see a man in a tailored suit step out with a clipboard, followed by an entourage of security personnel and military aides. But the side door of the helicopter slid open, and the man sitting inside was not wearing a suit. He was wearing a dark jacket, and his face was partially covered by a thick scarf. And more importantly, he was holding a heavy firearm, and he was pointing it directly at Liam and the rest of the guards. Before Liam's brain could fully process what he was looking at, the neat perimeter of prisoners behind him suddenly broke. Liam heard the violent crunch of heavy boots sprinting across the loose gravel. He turned his head and saw 3 men breaking from the front of the crowd, running at an absolute full sprint directly toward the center of the yard. Liam instantly recognized them. They were Seamus Toomey J., B. O'Hagan, and Kevin Mallon. These weren't just low-level offenders. They were the 3 highest-ranking provisional IRA commanders currently held in the entire facility. They had been planning this the entire time. The guards were completely frozen. Because they were stationed inside the yard directly among the inmates, strict prison regulations prohibited them from carrying firearms. The warden's logic was that bringing guns into a yard with 200 angry men was a recipe for the guards to get overpowered and their weapons taken. So the guards had absolutely nothing but heavy wooden batons, and the man sitting in the helicopter had a high-powered firearm pointed right at their chests. Liam and Chief Ward could do absolutely nothing but stand there and watch. The 3 IRA commanders ducked under the spinning rotor blades, grabbed the edge of the open doorway, and threw themselves into the back cabin of the helicopter. The moment the last man was inside, the man with the gun pulled the side door completely shut. The engine noise pitched up to a high, deafening scream. The helicopter lurched off the gravel, kicking up another massive wave of dust, and pulled straight up into the gray sky, clearing the 30-foot stone walls with ease. It banked hard to the north and sped away, shrinking back into a small dark dot before vanishing entirely. Based on police records, prison logs, and the pilot's eventual testimony here is a reconstruction of the events that led to the escape. The IRA outside the prison had managed to smuggle a coded message into the D-Wing, informing the three commanders of the exact date and time the helicopter would arrive. The entire operation was meticulously timed down to the minute to coincide perfectly with the afternoon exercise period when all the men would be out in the open yard. The man who called himself Mr. Hess was a highly trained operative who hijacked Captain Thompson and forced him to navigate directly to Mount Joy. They knew that if they flew a helicopter straight into a government facility, the guards on the ground would automatically assume it was a government official, and that assumption would buy them the handful of seconds they needed to touch down and get the men on board. And the plan worked flawlessly. The three prisoners successfully escaped maximum security, and the pilot was later dropped off unharmed in a remote field before the hijackers vanished completely. The event became massive international news, creating a deeply embarrassing security failure in the history of the Irish penal system, because the guards had essentially cleared a landing pad, straightened their ties, and respectfully stood at attention while their most high-value inmates literally flew away, as a direct result of the escape of Seamus Toomey J.B. O'Hagan and Kevin Mallon in 1973, the Irish government was forced to completely overhaul their security protocols, eventually installing thick, heavy steel cables across the open airspace of every single prison yard in the country to ensure nothing could ever drop out of the sky again. From the heavy stone walls of an Irish prison where a daring hijacking allowed men to vanish into the gray sky, we move to the busy, sun-baked streets of a Middle Eastern capital where the loud clatter of a bank lobby is about to be interrupted by a very different, much more violent kind of armed takeover. On the morning of October 18, 1973, a 32-year-old American named Thomas woke up in his second-floor apartment in the Hamra district of Beirut, Lebanon. The sun was just starting to cut through the wooden shutters of his bedroom, casting long, dusty stripes across the floorboards. Thomas rolled out of bed, walked into his small, tiled kitchen, and turned the dial on his gas stove. He filled a small copper pot with water and coffee grounds, letting it boil while he walked to the bathroom to shave. Thomas was a mid-level loan officer for the local branch of the Bank of America, and he had been living in the city for about 3 years. And you know, Beirut in the early 70s was incredibly cosmopolitan. People walked down the streets in tailored European suits. The cafes were always packed with tourists and businessmen, and the air constantly smelled of strong espresso sea salt from the Mediterranean and the exhaust of expensive cars. Thomas absolutely loved living there. He finished his coffee, put on a sharp gray suit, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked out of his apartment building into the already warm morning air. The walk to the bank took about 20 minutes. Thomas navigated through the crowded sidewalks, stepping around street vendors selling warm flatbread and dodging the aggressive morning traffic. He bought a local newspaper from a stand on the corner and tucked it under his arm. When he finally reached the financial district, the large, modern facade of the Bank of America building stood out right in the middle of the block. It was a massive structure with tall, heavy glass doors and a wide, open-plan lobby designed to look incredibly secure and professional. Thomas pushed his weight against the heavy brass handle of the front door and stepped inside. The air conditioning immediately hit him, providing a sharp, cool contrast to the heat of the street. Thomas waved to the security guard standing near the entrance, an older, local man who always had a radio earpiece in. Then he walked across the polished marble floor of the main lobby. Behind the long, curved mahogany teller counter, several bank employees were already busy organizing their cash drawers and stamping paperwork. Thomas walked behind the counter, greeted a young teller named Layla, and set his briefcase down on his desk in the open office area just behind the teller line. His routine every single morning was exactly the same. He spent the first hour reviewing loan applications, checking the daily exchange rates, and organizing the files he needed to review with the branch manager later that afternoon. Around 9 in the morning, the heavy glass doors at the front of the bank were unlocked for the public, and a steady stream of local merchants, foreign investors, and regular account holders began to filter into the lobby. By 10:30, the bank was completely full. There were about 43 people inside, a mix of employees and customers standing in neat lines waiting for a teller. The room was filled with the low hum of conversations in English, French, and Arabic, mixed with the rapid clicking of adding machines and the heavy thud of rubber stamps hitting paper. Thomas was sitting at his desk, holding a red pen over a stack of financial documents, listening to the familiar, rhythmic sounds of his workplace. And then, the heavy glass front doors were violently kicked open. The heavy brass handles slammed against the interior walls with a massive echoing crash that instantly stopped every single conversation in the room. Thomas jerked his head up. 5 men were pouring through the doorway. They were moving incredibly fast. They were wearing heavy military fatigues. Their faces were wrapped in dark, checkered scarves, and they were carrying heavy canvas duffel bags slung over their shoulders. But what made Thomas's stomach drop completely was the fact that every single one of these men was holding an automatic assault rifle. The man at the front of the group, who was noticeably taller than the rest, raised his rifle toward the high ceiling and pulled the trigger. The deafening mechanical explosion of automatic gunfire inside the enclosed marble lobby was absolutely physically painful. The bullets chewed into the plaster ceiling, sending a shower of white dust and debris raining down onto the customers. The taller man screamed at the top of his lungs, ordering every single person in the room to get down on their stomachs with their hands flat on the floor. Thomas immediately dropped to his knees, slid under his desk, and pressed his face against the cold tile. All around him, people were screaming and scrambling to get onto the floor. He could hear the heavy, frantic thud of boots running across the marble as the armed men spread out, physically shoving customers to the ground and dragging the security guard away from the front door. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He could hear the heavy canvas bags hitting the floor near the center of the lobby with a loud, metallic clink. The taller man began shouting orders in Arabic. 2 of the men ran directly to the heavy glass front doors. They pulled rolls of thick silver duct tape and stacks of local newspapers from their pockets. Working rapidly, they began taping the newspaper pages completely across the glass doors and the large front windows, totally blocking out the view from the street. Within minutes, the bright, sunlit lobby was plunged into a dim, muted shadow. The only light left was the artificial glow of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. The gunmen then moved behind the teller counter. They grabbed Thomas by the back of his suit jacket, dragged him out from under his desk, and shoved him toward the center of the lobby. They did the same to Layla and the other tellers, herding all 43 people into a tight, huddled group right in the middle of the marble floor. Thomas sat on his knees, his hands resting on the back of his head, looking around at the terrified faces of the businessmen and bank employees around him. The taller man, who was clearly the leader, paced back and forth in front of the group. He pulled a battery-powered megaphone from one of the canvas bags. The leader walked over to the front doors, cracked one of them open just an inch, and aimed the megaphone outside. The sound of police sirens was already wailing in the distance, growing louder and more frantic by the second. The leader pressed the button on the megaphone and announced to the gathering police force outside that they were the Lebanese Revolutionary Socialist Movement. He stated that they had 43 hostages, and they were demanding $10 million to fund their operations. He explicitly stated that if the police attempted to enter the building or if their demands were not met, they would kill everyone inside. He shut the door, locked it, and turned back to the hostages. He then nodded to 2 of his men. The men crouched down and unzipped the heavy canvas duffel bags they had dropped on the floor. Thomas watched closely as the men began pulling out thick, rectangular blocks of what looked like heavy gray clay. They also pulled out spools of thin red and black wire electrical tape and several small mechanical detonators. Thomas felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. It was explosives. A massive amount of explosives. The militants worked methodically. They walked over to the thick, load-bearing concrete pillars that supported the ceiling of the bank. They used the heavy duct tape to strap several blocks of the gray clay directly to the concrete. Then they walked into the huddled group of hostages. They grabbed the branch manager, and 2 of the older foreign businessmen pulled them to their feet and dragged them to the front of the room. The militants took the remaining blocks of explosives and physically taped them to the chests and backs of the 3 men. The hostages were completely sobbing, begging the men to stop, but the militants completely ignored them. Once the blocks were secured, the leader took the spools of wire. He carefully connected the explosives on the pillars to the explosives strapped to the hostages. He then ran the main line directly into a heavy plastic detonator switch that he held firmly in his left hand. The leader looked at the group of hostages and explained that the bank was now a bomb. If anyone tried to stand up, if anyone tried to run, or if he simply let go of the trigger in his hand, the entire building would collapse into the street. The standoff dragged on for hours. The air conditioning had been shut off and the temperature inside the sealed bank began to rise dramatically. The air grew incredibly stale, smelling of sweat, fear, and the sharp chemical odor of the explosive clay. Thomas sat on the hard marble floor, his legs cramping violently, but he did not dare shift his weight. The hostages were forced to sit in complete silence. Whenever a police siren wailed outside or a helicopter hovered overhead, the leader would grip the detonator switch tighter, his knuckles turning totally white. By the time night fell, the fluorescent lights inside the bank were the only source of illumination. The atmosphere was completely suffocating. The hostages were denied food and given only tiny sips of water from a single plastic cup the militants passed around. If someone had to use the restroom, they were escorted by a gunman who kept the barrel of an assault rifle pressed directly against their spine the entire time. Thomas watched as the three hostages with the explosives strapped to their chests sat perfectly rigid in chairs near the front doors, their faces completely drained of color, staring blankly at the floor. They looked like they were already dead. The second day was even worse. The heat inside the bank was absolutely punishing. The condensation literally dripped down the walls. Several of the older hostages were beginning to faint from dehydration, slumping over onto the marble floor. The militants were also showing signs of severe fatigue. They were pacing, constantly snapping at each other in harsh whispers, and constantly checking the street through tiny slits they had cut into the newspaper on the windows. The leader kept using the megaphone, demanding the $10 million, demanding a plane to take them out of the country. But outside, the Lebanese government was completely silent. They were not negotiating. They were not offering a plane. They were simply waiting. The sheer absolute silence from the outside world was causing the militants to become incredibly erratic. The leader started pointing his rifle directly at the hostages' heads, screaming that the government did not care about them and that they were all going to die here. Thomas leaned slightly toward Layla, who was violently trembling next to him, and whispered that they just had to stay low to the ground and stay completely still. By the evening of the second day, October 19th, the tension inside the bank was stretched to the absolute breaking point. The leader was standing near the center of the room, holding the detonator, looking exhausted and totally unhinged. The other militants were positioned around the perimeter, their rifles raised, their eyes darting nervously toward the front doors. And then suddenly, every single light inside the bank shut off. The entire building was plunged into total pitch-black darkness. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The constant hum of the city outside seemed to completely vanish. Thomas pressed his body as flat against the marble floor as he possibly could, covering the back of his neck with his hands. He could hear the heavy, frantic breathing of the militants in the dark. He heard the metallic clatter of the assault rifles being raised and the safety levers being clicked off. The leader started screaming into the dark, threatening to press the detonator. And then Thomas heard a sound that didn't come from the front doors. It came from directly above them. It sounded like heavy boots dragging across the roof of the bank. Based on Lebanese internal security forces, historical records, and international wire archives, here is a reconstruction of what happened next. The Lebanese government had completely refused to pay the massive ransom or negotiate with the militants. Instead, they had spent the last 48 hours secretly moving heavily armed military commandos onto the roof of the bank and the adjacent buildings. They knew the explosives were wired to the pillars and the hostages, which meant coming through the front doors would instantly trigger a massive detonation, so they decided to bypass the ground floor entirely. The darkness inside the bank was suddenly shattered by a series of massive, violent explosions that ripped directly through the ceiling. Huge slabs of plaster concrete and heavy ventilation ducts collapsed downward, crashing onto the marble floor and crushing the desks in the open office area. The entire lobby was instantly filled with a blinding, thick white cloud of pulverized concrete dust. Before the debris had even hit the floor, ropes dropped through the jagged holes in the ceiling, and heavily armed military commandos began sliding down directly into the center of the bank. The commandos threw flashbang grenades as they hit the floor. The grenades detonated with blinding flashes of white light and concussive booms that completely disoriented everyone in the room. The militants immediately opened fire, spraying automatic gunfire wildly into the dust cloud. The commandos returned fire instantly. The enclosed space became an absolute hurricane of flying lead, shattered glass, and screaming voices. Thomas kept his eyes squeezed shut, feeling the heavy impacts of bullets chipping the marble floor just inches from his head. He could hear the sharp, distinct cracks of the commandos' weapons cutting through the heavier sound of the militants' rifles. In the chaos, the militant leader realized the bank was completely compromised. He raised his left hand, fully intending to press down on the heavy plastic detonator and blow the entire building into the street. But before his thumb could fully depress the switch, a commando emerged from the thick white smoke and fired a 3-round burst directly into the leader's chest. The leader was thrown backward by the impact, his hand going completely slack, the detonator slipping from his fingers and clattering harmlessly onto the floor. With their leader dead, the remaining militants completely panicked. 2 of them tried to run toward the back exit, but they were immediately cut down by commando gunfire. The other 2 dropped their weapons, fell to their knees, and put their hands on their heads, surrendering to the soldiers who quickly swarmed them and pinned them to the marble floor. The deafening roar of gunfire abruptly ceased, leaving only the sound of coughing and the settling of heavy concrete dust. The commandos immediately moved to the hostages with the explosives strapped to them. Using heavy wire cutters, they carefully snipped the leads connected to the detonator blocks, fully disarming the explosive vests before physically peeling the clay blocks off the terrified men. Other soldiers grabbed Thomas Layla and the rest of the hostages by the arms, dragging them through the thick smoke and out the shattered front doors into the cool night air. The street was completely flooded with red and blue police lights, ambulances, and military vehicles. Thomas collapsed onto the pavement. His suit completely ruined his lungs, burning from the dust, but he was alive. The violent military intervention had successfully prevented the explosives from detonating, capturing, or killing the militants and freeing the remaining hostages, though the massive shootout left the interior of the bank completely destroyed, leaving a deep, bloody scar right in the center of the Modo, nation's capital. From the smoke-filled, shattered marble lobby of a bank where hostages survived a terrifying underground siege, we moved to a massive modern skyscraper in a bustling South American city where a simple electrical short is about to trap hundreds of people on a concrete roof with absolutely nowhere left to run. On the afternoon of February 24th, 1972, 28-year-old Roberto sat at his heavy metal desk on the 30th floor of the Edificio Andraus. This was a massive commercial skyscraper sitting right in the center of the bustling financial district of São Paulo, Brazil. The building was 32 stories of sheer concrete and glass housing, thousands of office workers, executives and clerical staff. Roberto worked as an accountant for a large logistics firm that occupied the entire 30th floor. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows and a dark gray necktie loosened around his collar. The air conditioning in the building was running at maximum capacity, but the Brazilian summer heat still managed to press heavily against the large plate glass windows that lined the exterior walls. Roberto had a stack of thick paper ledgers sitting on the right side of his desk, and a heavy mechanical adding machine sitting on the left. An office in 1972 was an incredibly noisy place. There were dozens of other desks arranged in neat rows all around him, and from every single direction, you could hear the constant, aggressive clacking of heavy manual typewriters striking paper. Rotary phones rang constantly, their sharp metallic bells echoing off the low-drop ceiling. Co-workers walked back and forth down the narrow aisles carrying stacks of manila folders, talking loudly over the ambient noise of the machines. Roberto leaned over his ledger, dragging a wooden pencil down a long column of numbers, occasionally reaching over to punch a sequence of heavy plastic keys on his adding machine. He pulled the heavy metal lever on the side of the machine, listening to the gears grind as it stamped the ink onto the rolling spool of receipt paper. Around 2 in the afternoon, Roberto stood up from his desk to stretch his legs. He walked over to the small break area near the central elevator bank to get a cup of black coffee. He stood by the small wooden table, pouring the hot coffee from a glass carafe into a ceramic mug, and he chatted for a few minutes with a young secretary named Luciana. They stood there talking about their plans for the upcoming weekend, taking sips of their coffee. The elevator doors opened and closed a few times, letting people on and off the heavy brass gears clicking loudly behind the plaster walls. Everything was completely standard. People were looking at their wristwatches, just waiting for the clock to hit 5 so they could go home. Down on the street level, the Edificio Andraus had a massive, multi-story neon advertising sign attached directly to the exterior concrete facade. This sign was built with hundreds of feet of thick electrical wiring and large glass tubes filled with gas. The wiring had been sitting out in the brutal sun and heavy rain for years. The rubber insulation wrapping one of the main power cables had slowly become brittle, cracking and flaking away to expose the raw copper wire underneath. As the electricity pumped through the heavy cable to keep the massive neon lights glowing, the exposed copper brushed directly against the grounded metal framing of the sign itself. A sharp, bright blue spark arced through the hot air. It hit a patch of dry debris and dust that had collected on the canvas awnings of the street-level shops located right at the base of the building. The dust smoldered for a fraction of a second before igniting into a small orange flame. The fire immediately spread across the canvas, melting the fabric and climbing upward onto the plastic housing of the sign. Once the fire found the massive electrical conduits and the exterior cosmetic paneling of the skyscraper, it began to climb. The flames fed on the combustible materials attached to the outside of the building, moving upward at an astonishing speed, completely swallowing the lower floors in a matter of minutes. Up on the 30th floor, Roberto had just returned to his desk and sat down. He picked up his pencil and looked at the ledger, and then he paused. He inhaled sharply through his nose. He could smell something sharply chemical, like melting plastic and burning rubber. He looked around the room. Several other accountants had stopped typing and were looking up at the ceiling. The smell was coming directly through the square metal air conditioning vents above their heads. A faint, thin gray haze was beginning to collect around the fluorescent light fixtures. Luciana stood up from her desk near the window and walked over to the glass. She placed her hands flat against the pane and looked straight down. Suddenly, she took 3 fast steps backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Roberto stood up and walked quickly to the window to see what she was looking at. When he looked down, he could not see the street. He could only see an incredibly thick, violently churning column of black smoke rising directly up the side of the building. Through the smoke, he could see bright, massive sheets of orange fire wrapping around the concrete pillars, just a few floors beneath them. The low hum of the office was instantly shattered by the sound of the fire outside. It sounded like a massive, heavy freight train roaring directly past the glass. The glass window panes themselves were becoming physically hot to the touch. The intense thermal expansion from the fire outside was causing the heavy glass to warp and groan. Someone near the back of the office yelled to get to the elevators. A rush of people pushed their way through the desks, knocking over, adding machines, and scattering ledgers across the linoleum floor. Roberto grabbed Luciana by the elbow and guided her toward the center of the building, where the elevator bank was located. But when they reached the brass doors, the circular dial indicating the floor numbers was completely dark. The main power to the entire skyscraper had already failed. The heavy brass doors were locked tightly in place. The entire building lost its artificial lighting, plunging the interior offices into a dim, murky shadow, lit only by the orange glow of the flames pressing against the exterior windows. Roberto knew the only other way down was the emergency stairwells. He pushed his way through the gathering crowd and reached for the heavy metal handle of the fire door. He pulled the door open. A solid, suffocating wall of blistering hot air and thick black smoke instantly blasted into the hallway, knocking Roberto backward. The enclosed concrete stairwell was acting precisely like a massive chimney. The fire had breached the lower floors, and the intense heat was drawing all the toxic smoke and superheated air directly up the central shaft of the building. Going down was completely impossible. Anyone who stepped into that stairwell would suffocate in seconds. The smoke pouring out of the open stairwell door quickly began filling the 30th floor. People were coughing heavily, their eyes watering and stinging from the harsh chemical fumes. Roberto realized that going down would kill them. Staying on the 30th floor would kill them. There was only one single direction left to go: up. Roberto yelled over the noise of the panic and the roaring fire, telling Luciana and the people immediately around him to head for the secondary access stairs that led to the roof. He led a group of dozens of workers away from the main stairwell, navigating blindly through the thickening smoke. They found the narrow concrete steps that serviced the upper mechanical floors. They climbed as fast as they physically could, their leather shoes slapping loudly against the concrete. They pushed past the 31st floor, then the 32nd floor, their lungs burning as they tried to pull oxygen from the contaminated air. They reached a heavy reinforced steel door at the very top of the landing. Several men threw their shoulders against the metal, shoving it open. The bright, harsh sunlight of the afternoon hit them, along with a massive rush of fresh wind. Roberto stumbled out onto the roof, pulling Luciana out behind him. The roof of the Edificio Andraus was a flat, wide expanse of gray concrete. In the very center, there was a raised square platform with a large yellow circle painted on it, designating it as a private corporate helipad. There was a low concrete parapet wall surrounding the outer edge of the roof to keep people from falling off. As Roberto wiped the stinging tears from his eyes, he realized he and his group were not the only ones who had the exact same idea. The roof was completely packed. Over 300 people from the upper floors of the skyscraper had fled upward when the stairwells filled with smoke. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, a massive crowd of men in ruined suits and women in dresses covering their faces with handkerchiefs and torn pieces of fabric. The situation on the roof was rapidly deteriorating. The fire had entirely engulfed the lower half of the 32-story building and was continuing to climb. The massive column of black smoke that had been rising up the side of the building was now catching the wind and blowing directly across the top of the roof, plunging the crowd into sudden periods of absolute blinding darkness. Roberto walked slowly toward the edge of the roof, joining a few other men who were looking over the low concrete wall down at the street. Far below, the avenues were completely swamped with red fire engines and police vehicles. Tiny figures in heavy yellow turnouts were unrolling canvas hoses and aiming streams of water at the base of the building, but the water barely made a dent in the massive wall of flames. Roberto watched as the fire department initiated their rescue protocol. A large ladder truck parked directly beneath them slowly extended its longest mechanical ladder. The heavy metal sections slid upward, reaching higher and higher into the sky. The people on the roof leaned over the edge, watching the ladder climb. But then the metal section stopped moving. The ladder had reached its absolute maximum physical extension. It was hovering somewhere around the 15th floor. It was less than halfway up the side of the skyscraper. A collective groan of despair rippled through the hundreds of people standing on the roof. They realized the fire department literally had no physical equipment capable of reaching them. They were entirely cut off from the earth. The heat radiating from the fire below was so unbelievably intense that it was changing the atmosphere around the building. Roberto looked across the avenue at the other commercial skyscrapers standing directly opposite the Edificio Andraus. The ambient heat from the fire was baking the air so aggressively that the heavy plate glass windows on the completely separate buildings across the street were actively buckling and shattering outward, showering the pavement far below with falling glass. The concrete beneath Roberto's shoes was growing noticeably warm. The fire was eating through the floors right beneath them. It was only a matter of time before the structural integrity of the roof failed or the smoke completely displaced the oxygen in the air. People were openly weeping, dropping to their knees on the hot concrete, holding onto each other. The smoke grew so thick that Roberto could not see his own hands in front of his face. The roar of the fire was a constant, deafening physical pressure against his ears. But then Roberto heard a new sound. It was distinct from the deep roar of the flames and the cracking of breaking glass. It was a sharp, rapid, heavy thudding sound. Thwack, 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 thwack. The sound echoed loudly off the concrete faces of the surrounding skyscrapers, growing louder and closer by the second. The wind shifted slightly, pushing the black smoke away from the center of the roof, just enough to reveal the sky. Hovering less than 50 feet directly above the terrified crowd was a large helicopter. The downdraft from its massive spinning rotor blades hit the roof with incredible force, kicking up loose gravel and blowing the smoke violently outward. And then just behind that helicopter, another dark shape appeared through the smoke. And then another. These were not coordinated municipal rescue vehicles. The city did not have a dedicated fleet of rescue helicopters. These were private, corporate, and off-duty military pilots who were flying nearby, heard the frantic emergency radio broadcasts, saw the massive column of smoke dominating the skyline, and made a unilateral, completely rogue decision to fly their personal aircraft directly into a major disaster. Zon. Based on official incident reports from the Sao Paulo Fire Department and Aviation Historical Archives, here is a reconstruction of the improvised rescue that followed. The airspace directly above a burning 32-story skyscraper is one of the most hostile flying environments on the planet. The massive fire below was consuming vast amounts of oxygen and generating an enormous amount of heat. This heat rose rapidly, creating intense, invisible columns of superheated air known as thermal updrafts. These updrafts were violently unstable. If a light helicopter flew directly into one of these thermals, the rapidly rising air could instantly strip the lift from the rotor blades, causing the aircraft to drop like a stone or violently flip upside down. Additionally, the thick black smoke reduced visibility to absolute zero. The pilots were flying blind, relying purely on their instruments and their instincts to keep from crashing directly into the side of the building or clipping their rotors on the surrounding antennas. The first pilot pushed his cyclic control stick forward carefully, lowering the nose of his helicopter into the thick smoke. He fought the aggressive turbulence, his hands constantly making tiny adjustments to keep the aircraft level. The small, raised yellow square of the helipad appeared through the haze. The pilot reduced his collective pitch, allowing the helicopter to drop heavily onto the concrete. The metal skids scraped harshly against the roof. The instant the helicopter touched down, a man wearing a pilot's headset leaned out of the open side door and frantically waved his arms at the crowd. Roberto grabbed Luciana's hand and pulled her forward. The crowd surged toward the spinning blades. The noise was absolutely deafening, and the wind from the rotors whipped their clothes and hair wildly. The pilot held up his hand, signaling them to stop when exactly 4 people had climbed into the small rear cabin. Roberto pushed Luciana into the back seat and stepped back, allowing another woman to take the final spot. The man at the door slid it shut and gave the pilot a thumbs up. The engine whined to a high pitch, and the helicopter lurched violently off the roof, banking hard to the left and disappearing back into the wall of black smoke. But as soon as that helicopter vanished, a second helicopter materialized from the sky and dropped down onto the exact same spot. For the next several hours, this improvised fleet of rogue pilots executed an endless cycle of touch-and-go landings. They would drop down onto the baking concrete roof, load 4 or 5 passengers into their cabins, lift off through the treacherous thermal updrafts, fly a few blocks away to a nearby open soccer field or the roof of a safe building, dump the understansive and building detective, passengers, and immediately fly directly back into the smoke. To get more. The pilots flew until their fuel gauges hit empty, landed at local airports to refuel with the engines still running, and flew right back to the burning skyscraper. They coordinated with each other over their radio frequencies, establishing a crude holding pattern in the smoke-choked sky, waiting for their turn to drop down onto the melting roof. Roberto stayed near the center of the roof, helping to organize the terrified crowd, physically pushing, exhausted, and choking people toward the open doors of the helicopters every time one touched down. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the air was so toxic that people were collapsing onto the concrete before they could even reach the aircraft. Roberto and other men physically dragged unconscious bodies to the landing pad, lifting them up and shoving them onto the floors of the helicopter cabins. Finally, as the sun began to set, and the fire continued to completely gut the interior of the Edificio Andraus, a small military helicopter touched down on the pad. Roberto was one of the last few dozen people remaining on the roof. The pilot waved him forward. Roberto climbed into the metal cabin, his clothes stained black with soot, his throat raw and bleeding from the smoke. The helicopter lifted off, banking sharply away from the inferno. Roberto looked out the small plexiglass window and watched the massive, burning concrete skeleton of the skyscraper recede into the distance. Through the sheer defiance of standard aviation safety rules and the incredible bravery of anonymous civilian and military pilots, over 300 people were successfully airlifted from the roof of the burning building, one by one. It remains one of the most daring, massive, and completely improvised aerial rescues in recorded history, saving hundreds of office workers from a fire that the ground crews simply could not reach. From the smoke-choked skies of South America, where rogue pilots pulled hundreds of people from a blazing skyscraper, we moved to the freezing fog-covered airspace of Alaska, where a routine flight carrying one of the most powerful men in Indo, America, was about to vanish completely from the face of the men. Earth, leaving behind absolutely zero trace. On the morning of October 16th, 1972, 58-year-old Hale Boggs woke up in his hotel room in Anchorage, Alaska. The room was dark, and the air pressing against the thick glass of the hotel window was freezing. Hale rolled out of bed, walked into the bathroom, and turned on the hot water in the sink. He splashed his face, grabbed his razor, and began to carefully shave. Hale was a man who lived a very structured, high-profile life. He was a long-serving politician from Louisiana, and he currently held the incredibly powerful position of Majority Leader of the United States House of Representatives. And you know, Hale was a Southern gentleman through and through. He was used to the heavy, warm humidity of New Orleans, the slow pace of the bayou, and the predictable routines of Washington, D.C. He was absolutely not used to the biting, aggressive cold of the Alaskan autumn. He finished shaving, dried his face, and walked over to the small closet to pick out his clothes. He put on a heavy wool suit, tied his necktie, and began gathering his paperwork into his leather briefcase. He had been traveling for days, and he was honestly feeling very tired. The only reason Hale was even in Alaska in the middle of October was to do a favor for a colleague. Nick Begich was a 39-year-old representative from Alaska who was currently running for re-election. Nick had asked Hale to fly up and make a few campaign appearances with him, knowing that having the House Majority Leader stand by his side would be a massive boost for his campaign. Hale, being a loyal guy, had agreed. So he snapped his briefcase shut, grabbed his heavy overcoat, and took the elevator down to the hotel lobby to meet his colleagues. When Hale stepped off the elevator, the lobby was busy with people getting their morning coffee. He immediately spotted Nick Begich standing near the front doors, talking with his aide, a 37-year-old man named Russell Brown. Standing right next to them was a 38-year-old local aviator named Don Johns. Don was a very well-known, highly experienced bush pilot who ran his own small aviation company in Anchorage. He wore a heavy leather jacket and carried a thick clipboard with flight charts. Hale walked over, shook their hands, and they all headed out the glass doors into the parking lot. The weather outside was absolutely miserable. A thick, flat gray fog hung low over the city, and a mix of freezing rain and wet snow was falling steadily. The wind blew off the water, cutting right through Hale's wool suit. They all climbed into a waiting car and drove toward Anchorage International Airport during the drive. Now, Nick and Hale went over their talking points for the fundraising dinner they were scheduled to attend later that evening in Juneau. Don the pilot sat in the front seat occasionally, looking out the window at the heavy clouds. When they arrived at the airport, they walked out onto the cold tarmac toward Don's plane. It was a twin-engine Cessna 310C painted white with yellow trim. It was a very small, compact aircraft. Don walked around the outside of the plane, doing his routine pre-flight check. He kicked the tires, checked the fuel caps, and used a rag to wipe a thin layer of morning frost off the leading edges of the aluminum wings. Don was an incredibly confident pilot. In fact, he had recently written a magazine article specifically about the challenges of flying small planes in icy conditions, basically arguing that a skilled pilot could handle it without a problem. Hale climbed up onto the wing and stepped down into the cramped cabin. The interior smelled heavily of aviation fuel and old leather. Hale took a seat in the back row, placing his briefcase on his lap. Russell Brown sat next to him. Nick Begich climbed into the front right passenger seat, and Don settled into the pilot's seat on the left. Don flipped a series of metal toggle switches on the dashboard, and the two propellers roared to life, vibrating the entire cabin. At 8:59 in the morning, the small Cessna taxied down the runway, picked up speed, and lifted off the pavement. The plane banked slightly and immediately vanished into the thick, low-hanging gray clouds, heading southeast toward Juneau. Several hours later, at the airport in Juneau, a small reception committee was gathered in the arrivals terminal. There were local politicians, campaign volunteers, and a few reporters holding notepads. They were standing around, drinking coffee, checking their watches, and talking about the upcoming election. The flight from Anchorage to Juneau was supposed to take roughly 3 hours. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, people in the terminal were starting to look out the large plate glass windows at the sky. The weather in Juneau was just as bad as it had been in Anchorage, with heavy rain and extremely low visibility. By 2 o'clock, the organizers of the fundraising dinner were pacing back and forth. They walked over to the airport information desk and asked the attendant if there were any delays. The attendant picked up a telephone and called the air traffic control tower in Anchorage. The controller in Anchorage checked the flight logs and confirmed that Don Johns' Cessna had taken off right on schedule just before 9 in the morning. However, when the attendant asked for the plane's current location, the controller paused. He explained that Don had not filed a mandatory instrument flight plan, relying instead on visual flight rule, which meant he was not actively being tracked by radar for the entire journey. Furthermore, the plane had not made a single radio contact since it left the airspace around Anchorage. The attendant hung up the phone and walked back to the reception committee. He quietly explained that the plane was officially overdue. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the group. By late afternoon, the situation escalated from a delay to a full-blown national emergency. The United States Coast Guard was notified, and within hours, the news reached the White House. President Richard Nixon was informed that the majority leader of the House of Representatives was missing. The president immediately ordered a massive, unprecedented search and rescue operation. He authorized the use of all available military and civilian resources in the region. The next morning, dozens of aircraft were scrambled. Coast Guard cutters pulled out of the harbor and began pushing through the rough, freezing waves of the Gulf of Alaska. Heavy military, C-130 Hercules transport planes roared off the runways, flying low over the jagged peaks of the Chugach Mountains. Civilian volunteers, heavily armed with survival gear, and radios hiked into the dense, snow-covered forests. In total, the search grid covered an unbelievable 324,000 square miles of some of the most rugged, isolated, and dangerous terrain on the planet. For the first few days, the search crews battled relentless blizzards. Helicopters were grounded by heavy winds, and the spotter planes had to fly completely blind through whiteout conditions. And yet the searchers remained highly motivated. Everyone knew the stakes. They flew grid patterns over the glaciers, staring down at the endless sea of white pine trees and deep, dark crevices, looking for any flash of yellow or white metal, any plume of black smoke, or any sign of a makeshift camp. On the fourth day of the search, the control center received a sudden, urgent piece of information. A civilian ham radio operator sitting in his home in Northern California called the authorities. He claimed that his equipment had picked up a very faint, repetitive electronic pinging sound on the emergency distress frequency. He provided a general set of coordinates based on the signal bounce. The search commanders immediately pulled their planes from the coastline and redirected them to the specific coordinates deep in the mountains. A fleet of helicopters flew into the area, hovering just a few dozen feet above the treetops. Ground teams were dropped into the snow and spent 2 solid days hiking through freezing temperatures, calling out on their bullhorns and sweeping the area with thermal cameras. But the woods were completely silent. There was no plane, no wreckage, and no signal. The radio transmission turned out to be an anomaly, a rogue bounce of static from a completely different source. A week later, another lead came in. A civilian pilot flying a small float plane over a massive glacier reported seeing a large, unnatural piece of bright orange fabric snagged in the upper branches of a pine tree near a deep ravine. He radioed it in, stating it looked exactly like the color of an emergency survival raft. A specialized mountain rescue team was loaded into a military helicopter and flown to the glacier. They rappelled down onto the ice and hiked for 6 hours through chest-deep snow to reach the tree. When they finally pulled the orange fabric down, they found it was nothing but an old, discarded weather balloon that had blown into the mountains years earlier. As the days turned into weeks, the sheer lack of any physical evidence began to spawn a massive wave of rumors and theories back in Washington. Hale Boggs was not just a politician. He was a man who had been involved in some of the most sensitive operations in the country. He had served on the Warren Commission, and he had recently made very aggressive, highly public speeches accusing the FBI and its director, J. Edgar Hoover, of operating like a secret police force and tapping the phones of elected officials. Because of his powerful position and his vocal criticisms, people in the Capitol began to whisper. They suggested that the plane did not crash because of the weather. They suggested that an explosive had been placed in the fuel tank, or that the altimeter had been intentionally tampered with before takeoff. But out in the freezing wilderness of Alaska, the search crews ignored the politics and kept flying. They pushed their aircraft to the absolute mechanical limit, flying through freezing fog and heavy turbulence. But the landscape offered absolutely nothing. Based on aviation records, meteorological data from that morning, and the official National Transportation Safety Board investigation here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to the flight. After taking off from Anchorage, Don Johns flew the Cessna Southeast, heading toward a narrow geographic bottleneck known as Portage Pass. This pass was a common route for small planes cutting through the mountains, but it was incredibly dangerous in bad weather. As the plane entered the pass, the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to 0. The temperature in the clouds was hovering exactly at the freezing point. As the Cessna pushed through the clouds, Millions of supercooled water droplets slammed into the leading edges of the aluminum wings and the propeller blades. Upon impact, the water froze instantly, creating a thick, solid layer of clear ice. This ice rapidly changed the aerodynamic shape of the wings, destroying their ability to generate lift. Within minutes, the ice added hundreds of pounds of dead weight to the small frame of the aircraft. Don Johns pushed the throttles forward, the two engines whining as they strained to keep the heavy plane in the air. But the plane was losing altitude rapidly. Blind in the fog, carrying a massive load of ice, the Cessna dropped out of the sky. It either plummeted directly into a deep, snow-filled mountain crevasse, or it fell completely into the dark, freezing waters of Prince William Sound. If it hit the ocean, the heavy engines would have dragged the plane straight to the bottom within seconds. If it hit a glacier, the ongoing blizzard would have covered the wreckage in several feet of fresh snow before the first search plane ever took off. On November 24, 1972, after 39 continuous days of flying, the United States government officially suspended the search. It stood as the largest and most expensive search and rescue operation in the history of the country. They had scoured thousands of miles of ocean and mountains. They found no distress beacon, no oil slick, no seat cushions, and no metal debris. The four men and the machine they were flying in had completely and totally vanished from the face of the earth. From the freezing white mountains of Alaska, where a small plane carrying a powerful politician disappeared without a single trace, we moved to the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean, where a massive steel cargo ship and its entire crew are about to sail directly into a storm and never return. On the morning of March 16th, 1973, 34-year-old Leif woke up in his narrow steel cabin aboard the SS Anita. The ship was currently docked in the massive commercial port of Newport News, Virginia. Leif rolled out of his small bunk, his feet hitting the cold metal floor. He walked over to the small stainless steel sink in the corner of his cabin, turned the heavy brass knob, and splashed cold water onto his face. He reached for a rough cotton towel and dried off, looking at his reflection in the small bolted mirror. He noticed a thin line of black dust accumulated right at his hairline. And, no matter how many times he showered, he just could not get rid of the coal dust. Leif was the first officer of the SS Anita, which was an absolutely massive Norwegian bulk freighter. The ship was roughly 700 feet long and weighed 20,000 tons, and its primary job was hauling raw industrial materials across the ocean. Leif put on a thick wool sweater, laced up his heavy leather work boots, and stepped out of his cabin into the long fluorescent-lit corridor. The entire ship was vibrating slightly, a constant low-frequency hum that he felt in the soles of his boots. He walked down the hallway, the smell of diesel fuel and old coffee growing stronger as he approached the crew mess hall. When he pushed the heavy metal door open, he saw about a dozen of the ship's 32 crew members sitting at the bolted-down tables eating breakfast. The mood in the room was mostly quiet, just the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates and the low murmur of men speaking in Norwegian. They were all tired. They had been in port for a few days, and loading coal was a notoriously dirty and exhausting process. Leif grabbed a mug, poured himself some black coffee from the large aluminum percolator, and sat down across from the ship's radio operator, a 22-year-old guy named Karsten. Karsten was reading a paperback novel, completely ignoring the heavy mechanical thuds echoing from the main deck directly above their heads. Those thuds were the sound of massive dockyard cranes, dropping thousands of tons of raw Virginia coal right into the belly of the ship. Leif took a sip of his coffee and tapped the table to get Karsten's attention. He told Karsten to make sure he updated the shipping company headquarters in Oslo before they cast off later that afternoon. Karsten marked his page in his book, looked up, and just nodded. He said he had already checked all the vacuum tubes on the main transmitter and everything was operating perfectly. He mentioned that the weather report for the North Atlantic looked a little rough, but nothing they couldn't handle. Leif agreed. The SS Anita was a state-of-the-art vessel built with incredibly thick steel plating, specifically designed to withstand the absolute worst conditions the ocean could throw at it. By late afternoon, the cargo holds were completely full. They were carrying tens of thousands of tons of coal destined for the industrial ports of West Germany. Leif walked the main deck, personally inspecting the massive steel hatch covers. These covers were absolutely critical. They weighed tons and rolled along heavy metal tracks to seal the cargo holds completely shut. If even a small amount of seawater got into those holds, it could cause the coal to shift, which was incredibly dangerous for the balance of the ship. Leif watched as the deckhands secured the heavy iron latches, locking the covers down tight. He gave a thumbs up to the captain standing up on the bridge wings. A few minutes later, the massive ship's horn blew a deep, bone-rattling sound that echoed across the Virginia coastline. The thick mooring lines were cast off, the massive diesel engines throttled up, and the SS Anita slowly pulled away from the dock, navigating out toward the open water of the Atlantic Ocean. For the first few days of the voyage, everything fell into a very standard, highly structured routine. The men worked their shifts, performed maintenance on the heavy machinery, and spent their off hours playing cards or writing letters home in the mess hall. But as they moved further northeast, tracking parallel to the United States eastern seaboard, the sky above them began to change. The bright blue faded into a heavy, bruised iron gray. The ambient air temperature dropped drastically, and the wind began to howl across the flat steel of the main deck. Up on the bridge, the captain stood near the thick glass windows, watching the bow of the ship carve through the growing waves. The ocean was churning, throwing heavy white foam up over the railing. Down in the cramped, warm radio room, Karsten sat in front of a massive console of dials and glowing green screens. He put on his heavy, black headphones and tapped out a routine weather update using Morse code, broadcasting it across the ocean back to their company headquarters in Norway. He reported that they were entering a storm system. The seas were rough and the wind was picking up, but the ship was handling it perfectly. There was absolutely no tone of panic or concern in his message. It was just a standard, boring administrative check-in. Thousands of miles away in Oslo, Norway, a dispatcher named Henrik sat in a quiet, heated office on the top floor of the shipping company's headquarters. It was snowing heavily outside his window. He logged Karsten's message into a large paper ledger, noted the time, and poured himself another cup of coffee. By protocol, the SS Anita was scheduled to send another routine check-in exactly 12 hours later. So Henrik finished his shift, went home, and slept. When he returned to the office the next morning, he grabbed the logbook from the night dispatcher to review the overnight communications. He ran his finger down the list of ships in their fleet. But when he got to the line for the SS Anita, the space for the overnight check-in was completely blank. Henrik asked the night dispatcher if he had missed a transmission. The night dispatcher shook his head and said there had been dead air all night. He hadn't heard a single blip from the Anita. Now, initially, Henrik was not overly concerned. In the North Atlantic, especially during the winter months, heavy winds and freezing rain frequently caused ice to build up on the exposed copper antenna wires strung between the ship's masts. The weight of the ice, or the sheer force of the wind, would often snap the wires completely, disabling the ship's ability to broadcast until a deckhand could climb up there and splice the wire back together. It was a common, annoying mechanical failure. Henrik looked at his large tracking map pinned to the wall. He noticed that another massive Norwegian freighter, a ship called the Norse Variant, was operating in the exact same geographic grid square as the Anita, heading in the same general direction. Henrik sat down at his radio console, dialed in the frequency for the Norse Variant, and pressed the microphone button. He asked the radio operator on the Norse Variant to try and raise the Anita on a short-range local frequency, just to see if they were out there. Henrik let go of the button and waited for the Norse Variant to reply. He listened to the soft hiss of static coming from the speaker. 1 minute passed. Then, 2 minutes. Henrik pressed the button again and repeated his request. Still nothing. Just the endless flat hiss of dead air. A cold, heavy knot formed in Henrik's stomach. One ship missing a check-in due to a broken antenna was completely normal. But two massive, modern, fully equipped steel freighters going completely silent in the exact same sector of the ocean at the exact same time was not normal at all. Henrik immediately picked up a red emergency telephone on his desk and contacted the United States Coast Guard Command Center. Within hours, the Coast Guard initiated a massive search and rescue operation. They looked at the meteorological data for the sector where the ships had last reported their positions. The weather out there had devolved from a winter storm into an absolute monster. It was essentially a hurricane. The wind was registering at over 80 miles an hour, and the waves were reaching heights of 50 feet. Despite the atrocious conditions, the Coast Guard deployed heavy cutters to punch through the massive waves. From an airbase in North Carolina, several massive C-130 Hercules transport planes roared off the runway, flying low through the blinding, freezing rain. The pilots and spotters strapped themselves into their seats, staring out the bubble windows at the endless churning black ocean, looking for any sign of a ship, a life raft, an oil slick, or a distress flare. On the second day of the search, the radio inside the Coast Guard Command Center crackled to life. One of the search planes reported spotting a massive, dark, metallic object floating upside down in the water, surrounded by a large debris field. The pilot said it looked exactly like the overturned hull of a large cargo ship. The command center immediately redirected 2 cutters to the coordinates. The captains of the cutters pushed their engines to the absolute limit, crashing through the violent swells to reach the location. The crews stood on the freezing decks, gripping the railings with their binoculars pressed to their eyes. But as the cutters pulled up alongside the object, the crew's hopeful anticipation completely evaporated. The object bobbing in the water was not the hull of a ship. It was a massive, rusted, cylindrical industrial buoy that had snapped its mooring chain from a coastal shelf miles away and drifted out to sea. The debris field around it was just a collection of commercial fishing nets and random ocean garbage. The cutters turned around and went back to their grid patterns. The next night, a civilian ham radio operator sitting in his basement in New Jersey suddenly picked up his telephone and called the local authorities. He claimed that, while scanning the emergency maritime frequencies, he had heard the distinct, sharp clicks of an SOS signal being tapped out in Morse code. It was incredibly faint, buried under layers of heavy static, but it was there. The Coast Guard immediately took the recording, ran it through their audio filters, and triangulated the source of the signal. They dispatched a heavy rescue helicopter which flew through the punishing winds right out to the exact coordinates. The helicopter hovered low over the black, violent water, shining a massive searchlight down onto the surface. The crew leaned out the open side doors, getting blasted by freezing sea spray, looking for a life raft or a survivor holding a transmitter. But there was absolutely nothing but empty ocean. The technicians back at the command center analyzed the signal again and realized they had been chasing a ghost. Due to the intense atmospheric conditions created by the storm, the SOS signal had actually originated from a small fishing boat thousands of miles away off the coast of South America, and the radio waves had simply bounced off the ionosphere and landed in New Jersey. The families of the 32 crewmen of the SS Anita gathered at the shipping company's offices in Norway, sleeping on the floor, waiting desperately for any news. For over a week, the search planes flew grid after grid, scanning hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean. Then on March 25th, a spotter on one of the planes caught a flash of bright neon orange against the dark gray water. The plane banked sharply, dropping low over the waves. The spotter grabbed his radio and shouted that he had eyes on a covered life raft bobbing heavily in the swells. A Coast Guard cutter arrived at the location shortly after. The crew threw grappling hooks, snagged the thick ropes on the side of the raft, and pulled it against the hull of the ship. Several men climbed down the scramble net, opened the flap of the orange canopy, and looked inside. Lying on the floor of the raft, surrounded by a few inches of freezing seawater, was a single man. His lips were completely blue, his skin was pale, and he was barely breathing, suffering from severe late-stage hypothermia. The crew physically carried him out of the raft, hoisted him up onto the deck, and rushed him directly into the ship's warm infirmary. They stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped him in thick thermal blankets, and began administering warm fluids. When the man's core temperature finally rose enough for him to speak, the Coast Guard commander stepped into the infirmary. He stood by the edge of the cot, looked down at the shivering man, and asked him what happened to the SS Anita. The commander asked if he had seen the ship go down or if he knew where the rest of his crew was. The man blinked his eyes, slowly looking completely confused. He cleared his throat and told the commander that he did not know anything about the SS Anita. He said his name was Stein Gabrielsen, and he was from the Norse variant. Stein explained that the storm they sailed into was the most violent, apocalyptic weather event he had ever witnessed in his life. The waves were towering completely over the bridge of the ship. He said the Norse variant had been struck by a massive rogue wave that physically tore the ship apart. The steel hull fractured and the ship sank into the ocean in a matter of minutes. Stein said he was the only person out of the 29 men on board to make it into a raft. When the commander asked him if he had seen the Anita out there in the storm, or if he had heard any radio chatter from them before the ship went down, Stein shook his head. He said the ocean was completely black and totally empty. When this information was relayed back to the command center, a horrifying realization settled over the investigators. The Norse variant was a massive ship, and it had been completely obliterated by the sheer physical force of the ocean so incredibly fast that 28 men did not even have time to abandon ship. But the SS Anita was even larger, heavier, and completely packed with 20,000 tons of solid coal. If the Norse variant had been destroyed, the SS Anita must have suffered the exact same catastrophic fate, but with 0 survivors. But what haunted the investigators the most was the radio. Even if the ship was going down fast, a trained radio operator like Karsten only needed a fraction of a single second to smash his hand down on the emergency distress switch. But he never did. Based on maritime meteorological data, the survivors' account from the neighboring ship and naval engineering analysis, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to the SS Anita and her 32 crewmen. It was the middle of the night. Leif and the captain were standing on the bridge, gripping the metal handrails to keep from being thrown to the floor. The noise outside the thick glass windows was completely deafening. The wind was screaming at over 80 miles an hour, ripping the paint right off the exterior steel bulkheads. The ship was pitching violently, the bow climbing slowly up the face of a massive wave and then slamming brutally down into the deep trough on the other side. Down in the massive cargo holds, the sheer physical violence of the motion was having a catastrophic effect. 20,000 tons of raw coal were being thrown slightly to the left and then slightly to the right, with every single roll of the ship. Coal is incredibly dangerous bulk cargo because it can shift, and if too much of it shifts to one side, the ship completely loses its center of gravity and cannot pull itself back upright. Suddenly, the SS Anita dropped heavily into a deep black trough between 2 swells. But before the bow could rise again to meet the next wave, a freak anomaly of fluid dynamics occurred. A rogue wave, a vertical wall of solid black water measuring over 60 feet high, materialized out of the dark and slammed directly downward onto the main deck of the ship. The sheer physical weight of millions of gallons of water crashing down simultaneously onto the steel hatch covers was too much. The heavy iron latches violently buckled and snapped. The massive steel covers caved inward, and the freezing ocean instantly flooded directly into the open cargo holds. At that exact same fraction of a second, the violent downward impact caused the entire 20,000-ton load of coal to shift entirely to the starboard side. The ship instantly and violently rolled completely over onto its side. Down in the radio room, Karsten was thrown violently out of his chair, his body slamming against the steel bulkhead. He scrambled in the dark, reaching his hand up toward the emergency distress switch on the console. But the incoming seawater instantly flooded the engine room below, completely shorting out the main generators. The entire ship was plunged into total absolute darkness, severing all power to the radio before Karsten's fingers could even brush the switch. There was absolutely no time to launch a life raft. There was no time to put on a life jacket. There was no time to even scream. In a matter of seconds, the massive ship rolled completely upside down. The immense weight of the flooded cargo holds and the solid steel dragged the SS Anita rapidly beneath the churning white caps. The 20,000-ton behemoth plummeted straight down toward the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, taking all 32 men with it into the freezing, pitch-black abyss. Weeks later, long after the massive search operation had been officially suspended and the families in Norway had held empty memorial services, a passing commercial ship spotted a small round object bobbing alone in the water hundreds of miles away from the last known coordinates of the storm. The crew pulled it aboard and set it on the deck. It was a single white circular life buoy. Painted on the side in faded black letters was the word Anita. It remains the only piece of physical evidence ever recovered from